I now call this meeting to order. If folks would please take their seats, we can begin. Thank you so much for joining us. Lynette, would you please begin with roll call? Here.
Regent Buchanan. Here. Regent Tess.
Here.
Regent Robinson is excused. Regent Teal.
Here.
Regent Williams.
Here.
Regent Krause.
Here.
Commissioner Christian.
Here.
I don't believe we have someone from the superintendent's office yet, and anybody from the governor's office.
Okay. Thank you, Lynette. I do believe Mr. Jim Malloy from the governor's office will be joining us later today, I think around 2:30. So we look forward to that. At this time, I would entertain a motion to approve the January 8th, 2013 minutes.
So moved.
A motion has been made. Are there any questions or comments from members of the board? Any public comment? Any public comment? A motion has been made. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Same sign. Motion carries. Thank you. At this time, we have an opportunity to make a couple of introductions, and I'd like to begin with a gentleman who we are so very glad to have us to be able to join us at the table here today. Certainly a friend of the Montana University system, and we have appreciated his tireless advocacy on our behalf. And we've all watched from our computers and sometimes from the Senate gallery and sometimes from the committee room as he has articulated the importance of the good work of the Montana University system. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to all of you Senator Taylor Brown. Welcome. I would also like to introduce Patty Myers, who is the chair of the Board of Public Education. She is here with us today. And Mr. Pete Donovan, who is the executive secretary of the Board of Public Education. He is also here with us today. And before I turn it over to the campuses for their introductions, I would like to have you join me in welcoming back to the table Major Robinson. Once he can return to the table, we look forward to having him back. And also, I want you to join me in welcoming the reappointment of Regent Paul Tuss. So we welcome you back and look forward to having Regent Robinson with us. And at this time, I would look to the campuses for their respective introductions.
I would like to introduce Jessie Duffner. She is the new Vice President of Student Success at MUS Community College. Jessie.
I would like to introduce two new people at Great Falls College. I have Dr. Daryl Stevens, who's our new Chief Financial Officer. And also Dr. Camille Consalvo, she's our new Associate Dean of Student Services.
Okay, if that concludes our introductions, then we will move into just a few remarks that I have. And let me begin by thanking each of you for your advocacy on behalf of the system during the first half of the session. I think that there was extraordinary visibility and great communication with lawmakers across the state on behalf of our respective campuses and on behalf of all of the students that we serve. And I want to thank you for all of that. I'd also like to extend a great big round of appreciation to MAS and our student regent, Joe Teal, and all of the students who have been a part of the effort to organize Rotunda Day at the Capitol. We appreciate the efforts of MAS, Regent Teal, and if you would please extend our appreciation to all of the student members there on behalf of all of us across the Montana University system. We appreciate your efforts, and that is taking place right now. So thank you very much for all of those efforts. They have not gone unnoticed by us or by the students across the system. I just have a few other comments that I'd like to make for the good of the order in respect to some of the things that we've been working on as a board. First of all, in the last couple of weeks, I've had the opportunity to meet a couple of times with Governor Bullock's senior policy advisor, Jim Malloy. And last night had the opportunity to meet with him and Chair Myers from the Board of Public Education. And Mr. Malloy has indicated that after the legislative session is complete, that we will be meeting for the first time in over a year with the Board of Education. And so we look forward to that. And Mr. Malloy, as I indicated earlier, will be joining us at the table later on this afternoon. In January, I opened up the meeting and articulated that if Montana's 63rd Legislative Assembly agreed to fund the increase in present law and fully fund the state pay plan in House Bill 13, that we as a board were prepared to freeze tuition in May. Since that time, the subcommittee voted 9-0 to fund the present law increase request contained in House Bill 2. And since that time, an addendum to the CAP agreement made with Governor Bullock was signed by all 9 members of that subcommittee, as well as Commissioner Christian, indicating our willingness to establish metrics and goals the first year of the biennium and allocate 5% of our overall budget the second year towards performance funding, which is outlined as part of our success agenda. This cooperation and collaboration between the governor's office, the state legislature, the office of the commissioner, and this board, I think, is unprecedented and historical. Thank you to all who came to the table and continue to work towards our primary goal this legislative session of a CAP. A special thanks to Governor Bullock, to our legislative partners, and Senator Brown, if you would please articulate our appreciation to the rest of your committee and to the folks in the Senate who supported the resolution last Monday, as well as to the chair and to the vice chair of the committee, and to the commissioner and his staff who have put in countless hours at the Capitol to see this to fruition, and to each of the folks who lobby on behalf of the Montana University system and the students that we serve. I think it's important to remind everybody at the table and all in the room, I think that we're far from finished, and I think that we have a long journey between now and the end of the session. I think we must secure the same support for our appropriation in House Bill 2 in the next half of the session as we got the first half, and we must tirelessly advocate for full funding of a pay plan so that we can ensure the CAP come May. So our advocacy is far from over. In February, just switching streets here, in February, the Coalition of Union Faculty organized a meeting at the Helena campus right here in the lecture hall. And they established a plan to begin to address the issues of compression and inversion on our campuses. And they right now have 2 subcommittees of that group that met. One will determine the best set of data to use as comparators when we're talking about faculty salaries. And then the other part of the subcommittee will work to determine a plan or a roadmap that would make sense over the course of this biennium and bienniums to follow, so that we can systemically begin to address the very important issues of compression and inversion that exist on our campuses. And then going back to January, I want to let you all know that I had the opportunity to attend, at the invitation of Pat Schlaw from the Student Assistance Foundation, a superb conference speaking to the importance of need-based aid and the work that needs to be done on that front. The keynote speakers were our very own Tyler Trevor and Tom Mortensen of the Pell Institute. One of the panelists was Ron Muffick, and he is here today, and it is good to see him. Both of the keynote speakers reminded attendees of the importance of strategic direction of our finite resources that we have available. And I would tell you that Ron Muffick spoke very well to the direction of his office in that regard, and we will continue to focus our efforts in this regard to meet the needs of our students. And then finally, we continue our collaboration with our partners in K-12 and our work with the Office of Public Instruction and our work with the Board of Public Education. It seems to me that these partnerships happen somewhat organically, and sometimes they don't necessarily happen as a result of what happens here at the table, but I can assure you that they are happening. And one of those partnerships happens year in and year out in classrooms across Montana, and that is the placement of student teachers. And right now I have a student teacher who comes to me from Montana State University. Her name is Megan Haskett, and I want to commend the folks at Montana State University for their excellent preparation of Megan. She is going to be a dynamic faculty member, and any school district that gets her will be very lucky. So thank you to your folks in your education department, Madam President. I think another area where there's a natural partnership between us and K-12 is of course, the Graduation Matters initiative. There's another natural partnership that's taking place today on the Montana Tech campus, where students from Southwest Montana are going to the Montana Tech campus and showing their wares in the science fair. And then the students who advance on from there will go to the University of Montana for the next level of competition. And so there's, I think, extraordinary outreach that is happening already. And I also want to speak to, I think, the project that was launched through the University of Montana in conjunction with the Washington Foundation and the Missoula County Public Schools in an effort to impact positively student learning. So I think there's a lot already happening and will continue to happen. And I'm confident that our partnerships with K-12 are about to get even stronger as we prepare for our first Board of Education meeting in a couple of years. I am eager to work even more closely with the Board of Public Education, with Superintendent Juneau, and with all of our education partners through the reestablishment of the P20 committee to positively impact the learning of all of our students in Montana. And just so you know, some of the conversations that are being had around that include effectively addressing remediation and transforming that, and that's something we just heard in the meeting we came from, and also growing the opportunities for dual enrollment, face-to-face opportunities for dual enrollment across our high school campuses across Montana. So that's what we as a board have been working on the last couple of months since we met the last time, and I thank you all so very much for the good work you are doing on your campuses. I ask you to continue that good work and great advocacy on behalf of all of the students that we serve. And so at this time, I would look to Dean Bingham for his remarks. We thank you for hosting us today and tomorrow.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Commissioner and Board of Regents members. We welcome you here to the Helena campus. The fact that you're actually here, the meeting has started, means that you are successful as individuals. You found a parking space, and we hope that that continues throughout the next few days for you. We are thankful that you'd come to the campus here. We enjoy having so many come and see the campus and enjoy what we're able to do for the Board of Regents and having a successful meeting. I think the agenda pretty much will spells where you need to be for lunch and things like that. So, and it's a small campus, so you can't get too lost. We'll help you find where you need to be. I would like to take just a few moments, if I may, Madam Chair, to share with you a pretty exciting activity that's happened on campus. We have Dr. Nathan Munn here today, who is in our psychology department. He is an individual that has worked with the direct mental health care. We have Mr. Matt Coons, who is Executive Director of NAMI, Montana, and Andrea Egger, who is a student. And they'd like to share with you in just a few moments a project that they've been working on that hopefully will end in being attached to some legislation here. So, Dr. Munn.
Thank you, Dr. Bingham. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the board as well. Just in brief, last fall, the National Alliance for Mental Illness sponsored what they called a Montana Institute Reboot Contest to address the long-standing problems in the mental health system of Montana. Several mental health direct care students and myself, over a course of a couple of weeks, discussed some possibilities for this contest. We entered it, and we developed a system, a fairly sweeping revamping of the mental health system of Montana, included improved training of mental health direct care workers through specialized training programs like that offered here at Helena College, ongoing workforce medical development training for current mental health direct care providers across the state, possible licensure of the same. Also, a centralized case management system to coordinate care for all the providers across the state and all facilities. Long-term psychiatric facilities would be started in various communities away from just Montana State Hospital, though it too would continue. And to have some mentally ill people, prisoners, transferred from the state prison to the state hospital campus. In addition, we had some ideas of expanding and creating some evidence-based alternative care programs such as peer support services, the training of lay people actually in treating or in detecting depression and anxiety, and web-delivered self-management for depression. Also, as you may know, we have a very high level of suicide in our state, so we also had a screening program to screen for people with suicidal ideation and the ability to get them into care. And finally, the idea of will any of this work came forward. So included in the proposal was a research base to monitor outcomes, see changes if necessary, et cetera. Well, after we submitted this, we won. So it was pretty cool. Apparently there's quite a bit of competition around the state. So I think it speaks to the Helena College students' high level of intelligence, creativity, and commitment. And as mentioned, Representative Jenny Eck is including this or using this as a template for House Joint Resolution number 16. She's not able to be here today, but she did send a statement, and I'd like to read that statement if I could quickly here. So she says, "I'm really excited about what these students have done. Their work inspired me to sponsor HJ 16. Their work demonstrated that there is a lot of room to improve treatment and results for those with mental illness in Montana, while also saving the taxpayers' money. I want these students to know that their work won't end with this prize. My goal is to make sure that their research goes toward making long-term change." So it's a pretty exciting development for us here. I'd like to turn over to Matt Kuntz. Matt?
Thank you, Dr. Munn. Just want to really say how great it's been to work with these students. And NAMI Montana works to improve Montana's mental illness treatment system every day, all day. And there's so many challenges that we face, especially that suicide epidemic. Largest state mental institution is the state prison. I mean, we're really struggling as a state, and we created this prize to say how much room is there to change? How much room is there to change things in 10 years and in 20 years to improve the cost effectiveness and the quality of care? And when you create a prize, you never know who you're going to get to respond. And we were very fortunate to have responses from across the state, and the quality of Helena College's response was really amazing. And it demonstrated to me that there is a lot of room to improve, and especially if we're able to pull in some insights from the university system, it's exciting to see where we're going to go. So I'm really excited about this House Joint Resolution 16. It'll create an interim study to see where we can go from here, and I hope that the Montana university system can be involved, because the best state mental illness treatment programs are tied to their university systems, and it will also include the quality of care and training that you provide to your counseling students, your psychiatric nursing programs, your nursing, psychology, and the different folks that Nathan's been working with in the direct care. So thank you very much for being involved with this, and we're really excited to see where it goes. And I'll turn over to Andrea Edgar, one of the students that worked on the prize.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning. My name's Andrea Edgar, and I am a face of a family member affected by suicide. I was in 5th grade when my grandfather completed his suicide, and to this day I still have many unanswered questions. Mental health care is such a hot-button topic, not only in our state, but in the rest of the 49 states that make up our great nation. But today I stand before you asking that you help us implement change in a positive manner, so that not one more Montanan falls through the cracks because they are in crisis mode and they are not able to access care because they're in a rural location that may not have a provider. Or perhaps they're in a community that has a provider available to them, but they still are not able to access care because that provider is so overwhelmed with trying to care for as many people as they can effectively care for. How can we bring about this change? By providing us training, access to education, because we know that knowledge is power. So thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for me?
Are there questions or comments from members of the board?
Again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Great presentation and great work. Thank you. At this time, I would like to introduce and invite State Senator Dave Wanzenreed to the table to join us, if you would like to come and join us. Thank you, everybody. This is Senator Dave Wanzenreed from Missoula. Good to see you, Senator. At this time now, I will turn it over to our commissioner for his report.
Madam Chair, thank you. We will dive right in. First thing on my agenda today is to discuss an update on the Milk River Ranch purchase with regards to the archaeological and paleontological rights that was discussed first at our November board meeting. As you all will recall, that came fairly quickly to us without a lot of time to prepare at the November meeting. And so we did sort of a unique approval, which we don't often do, but in this case, the board moved forward the purchase of these rights, or the potential purchase of these rights, and gave President Engstrom and myself the authority to do the diligence that is needed on the project to see if it was in the best interest of the university system to move forward. I will tell you, I sort of reshaped where I thought our thought process was at the January board meeting, which was sort of 3 unanswered questions. How does it fit with students and faculty and the research agendas that we have within our own mission? Where are the funds coming from, and where did we place the value in terms of the purchase price and where we thought we were going? I will tell you that I think we've come to a spot where, probably the question that relates to students, faculty, and the research agenda, it still probably has a place, and it fits in many regards on that end. But all things have to come with a balance, and how does it fit in our mission when we start discussing where the funds come from or where the funds have to come from? And that has been a challenge, and one that we have felt like we've sort of hit a roadblock on. And also the third leg of that stool was, where are we at on value? The board policy requires that we have at least 2 appraisals when making a purchase. We had 1 at the time of the meeting in November. We've spent some time on value. What we've learned is archaeological and paleontological rights are very hard to value, and there's a wide variety of opinions on what those values may be, all the way from sort of a black market value, which is extremely high, to a realistic value of what a university or a university system should be paying for what may be sort of public goods, public rights anyway. And so we've struggled with some of those pieces. And I think the long and the short of this update is, at this point in time, we don't feel like it's in the best interest of the university system to move forward. And so whatever approval or authority we had at the November meeting, we are basically relinquishing at this meeting. If any conversations would either begin or end in the future on this project, we would come back to the board and sort of start the process over in a new meeting and a new process. So that, Madam Chair, is really the update on that. We're not seeking to move forward on this project, and we're not seeking funds to do so. Any questions from the board on that?
Regent Williams?
Madam Chair and Commissioner, I recognize the 3 points that the good commissioner has outlined. I do have concern if the intent, at least of the Commissioner's office, is to abandon consideration of this. I don't think that's what the Commissioner said, but as one board member, I wouldn't want to abandon consideration of this. It does seem to me that we may have to continue to think about it and reconsider this acquisition under different conditions than we have in the past. I say reconsider because it seems to me that, and we would know this perhaps from another close look by an outside group, but it seems to me that, and it seems to the state of Montana, which has already purchased this property for a considerable amount of money, that this is a world-class find. And our university system students who are in the studies of the past, paleontology, history, early societies, have with this find the opportunity to do on-the-ground work that is available to very few students in very few places in this country. I don't think we should abandon that potential. So I'm hopeful that, Madam Chair, that we can keep this alive, perhaps delay it through until we want to reconsider it. But I would personally disagree with the abandonment of the project, simply because it seems to me that it would not be in the interest of our students to do so. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Regent Williams.
Madam Chair, Regent Williams, I don't disagree with your statements. I don't fancy myself as very old, but I have lived long enough to know I don't draw too many real definitive lines in the sand. That there may be a conversation to have, but I think it's important for this board to know that at this point in time, the approval that we had from the November meeting, we do not intend to act on or move forward. And the potential source of funds that we had identified, we do not intend to use. Those funds that we were considering, most of them have already been used as part of the EPSCoR match, which really is candidly a higher priority for us at this point in time. The remainder of those funds will likely be used for a continued EPSCoR match into the next year, which is important for us to continue with a $40 million grant. And so really, we don't identify any funds available. There were conversations at that time in November with the governor's office and others as to where maybe we can find funds. We've not identified any, and so we just truthfully don't have funds available at this point in time. And then we go back to the value question of what is the value and what would be the right value for a system to pay. There's good arguments to be made that a system shouldn't put a value on archaeological or paleontological rights. Most of those have been, or all of those have been donated over the years to university systems around the country, and whether we want to set new precedents there. Those are some of the things under consideration that I guess I would say at this point in time, we're not seeking to move forward. Does that close the door on any conversation ever? Probably not, but it certainly closes the door on this round that we had open and approval for in November, and the funds that we identified in those, and I just want to be clear to the board with that regard.
Thank you, Commissioner Christian. Regent Kraus.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman, Mr. Commissioner. Regent Williams, I'm sorry I wasn't at the November meeting. I think I sort of feel like buying the rights would set a dangerous precedent, and I'm wondering if do would you feel better if we took a vote or something like that? I guess I'd get that out of the way first, if you want us to have a vote or make a motion or something to support your idea, then maybe we should figure that out. But there's a number of things. There's lots of collections going on in the area. They're going on other private land, and they have been collecting there for decades, many decades, and I don't know that, they haven't pulled Sioux out of there, so it's, it might not be as incredible as we might guess. And I don't want to argue with I almost called him Congressman Williams, but Regent Williams. But I do think that it sets a bad precedent to buy. And actually, representatives of MSU have gone back to Congress and said, please don't allow this activity to happen. And so it's buying collections, buying these rights is sort of against the ethics of vertebrate paleontologists and others. So it's kind of we'd be doing what we've gone in front of Congress to say, please don't allow to happen. And I recognize that there is this part of me that says, boy, I just want to preserve this for future Montanans, but we should be able to do that. I don't know that there are other universities out there that are going to have any different ethic than the one that I just expressed, which is we don't buy fossils and we don't buy collecting rights to fossils. So it's that comes from the organizations themselves. And then I just think the value situation that you talked about, they've been collecting for years and years there and haven't found the kind of things that add that huge value to the collection. So I'm just not sure that we need to go, engage in this at this time. And I just wonder if you want to, if you need a backup and you need a vote on this, or
Madam Chair.
because you got two different points of view.
Regent Cross, I don't. I mean, we didn't notice as an action item. I don't actually think we need an action item. It won't be the first thing we had authority to do that we didn't do.
Okay.
So I don't think there's an issue there, and it probably doesn't need or deserve too much debate to not move forward with something. But I think your points are well taken, and we're certainly part of the president and my review and overview and ultimate decision to leave this thing as it is. The land has been protected by the state, and there's some value in that, to Regent Williams' point, but the value of those rights, the transferability of those rights, I mean, I have a number of questions about it, and ultimately, in the end, we don't have funds to commit to it. At least we don't have funds that we want to prioritize to commit to it, even if that was part of the discussion. So, I think two legs of the three-leg stool have fallen out, in my opinion, and so that's where it sits, and we won't move forward. And whatever authority we had, I'm saying here on the open mic that we've basically relinquished that, and if any conversation is to be regendered somewhere down in the future, that's fine, but it would come back to this board for full consideration.
Thank you. Were there further questions or comments? Regent Tuss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A question for the Commissioner. Commissioner, given the fact that the land itself is now owned by the state of Montana through Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and DNRC, is it legally clear that University of Montana, Montana State University students cannot use this property to explore the assets that exist there?
Madam Chair, Regent Tuss, that, to be honest with you, is probably a larger debate for a different time. I mean, you're really embarking on a legal question. I certainly can't avoid the last 20 years of my life, which has been in the title insurance business. I do have some questions about the ability to retain and convey archaeological, paleontological rights. Yeah, I don't even know what they are. They're not necessarily fee any longer because they've probably been severed from the fee. So you can get into an argument of personal property characteristics of them and how those are excluded from a servient or dominant estate. I'm not 100% sure. Part of my, I guess, concern in evaluating the potential purchase also includes some of those questions and thoughts. I don't think I can tell you, though, the answer. It's probably a decision for a legal team and ultimately possibly a judge or others, but I don't know. I certainly think, though, that it's why we're at where we're at, which there's enough unanswered questions that it's just not the best interest for us to move forward at this time.
Further questions or comments from members of the board? Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I...
Regent Williams.
If I might just respond, I agree with Regent Kraus that selling, except giving monetary gain for fossils is something I don't personally support. But they will be bought. The question now is by who? Access to this find was denied the state in their purchase. So if it's going to be accessed for the purpose of research, it has to be, a new deal has to be done, it has to be purchased. The question is, will the people who hold the rights to this wonderful treasure and hold the rights to access to it, are they going to find another buyer? And in my opinion, the answer is yes. And so Montana will have lost another treasure to an out-of-state buyer who might be the worst of all buyers we can imagine, those of us who object to the selling of architectural reserves and fossil remains. Notre Dame is interested in it and has been to the site many times. They may well want to buy it for their students. And Montana, as I say, will have lost again. The Treasure State will have sold out another treasure when we had the chance to hold it. Museums are interested in it. Out of state. The land is protected, that's correct. Somebody said the land is protected, and that's right. This treasure under discussion here is not protected. That's what we're talking about. With regard to money, the state of Montana and the university system has never had as much money as it has today. And I just don't want the people that come after us to look back and say, when they had a pot full of money, they let this treasure go and claimed lack of money as the reason. It seems to me that the board, certainly the commissioner's office, in taking with regard to the commissioner's office, the close look they have on it, has made up their mind. I just want to say again that I think we're bordering on a big mistake here. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Williams. Further questions or comments from members of the board? Okay, thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I'll turn it back to you.
Madam Chair, we move to the legislative update. Just want to get everybody up to speed on where we're at in the process. I think our chair gave you a little update within her opening comments. The House Bill 2 has moved through its subcommittee. We, as was said, signed the cap agreement somewhere along the line, an agreement that you all were well aware of at going back to our September meeting. As you recall, for whatever reason, we didn't get that finalized at the September meeting, and by the November meeting, we were in the process of having a new governor in 3 days, so we just left it sit there until a governor was elected, and we have now signed that cap agreement. It is in place. I would like to make, I guess, a couple comments about the cap. I don't want us, the cap is a very good document, and it's a commitment from us to do certain things. But I don't want all of what we're doing within House Bill 2 and through the legislative process to get lost in that. I think to some extent we start talking about what the cap does, which is essentially commits this board to freezing tuition, and it sort of turns into, and I hear that some of the discussions around it turning a bit into, well, that buys tuition, or that's our tuition, or those kind of conversation. And it's not really that. If you guys recall, what is in House Bill 2 is our present law adjustments, and that's the big piece of House Bill 2 that's very important to us. Those present law adjustments have moved out of the subcommittee, funded at where the governor had put those in. We believe and have that those requests were founded and adequate, but are certainly conservative in the terms of moving forward needed present law adjustments for us. With those present law adjustments and with a pay plan together, we've said if that's something that could come out of the legislature fully funded, that we would be willing as a board to freeze tuition. And I clearly heard over the last year that is a priority of the board. Freezing tuition is a priority of the board regardless of funding. Our ability to do so without funding and without a pay plan is pretty limited. Although I think this board has now an 8-year track record of doing all it can do to keep tuition increases, if needed, as low as possible. And so that is where we sit. The agreement commits us to that. I think the funding is moving out of subcommittees on track with much help from our partners in that committee, Taylor Brown being one of them. And we had some interesting discussions around the cap agreement, getting to where, what does that mean for both the subcommittee and ultimately for our funding? And we embarked on some good conversations about trying to meet not only the goals of affordability, but the goals of performance. And I think the conversations we had was, how can we use the cap to drive some performance measures that are important to a lot of our partners in the legislature? And I think what we kind of got to is, well, it's not real easy to do that. They're sort of apples and oranges. When you start talking about affordability, you're talking about making access available to a broad range of students throughout Montana. When you're talking about performance, it's a little bit of a different animal. And so we really worked together with Senator Brown and Senator Jones primarily, but the entire subcommittee to some extent, to come up with how can we not only meet our goals of an adequate present law funding, but how can we meet some of the goals of our legislative partners? And that goal, I think, real simply stated, is some accountability. And I personally think that that's a very fair request. We go to the legislature every 2 years and we ask for a significant piece of their budget. And for that, I think it's fair for us to be held accountable. I think it's fair to say, what are you guys going to do with that money? And the constitutional divide and other ways that we've been structured now since 1972 sort of put the Board of Regents and the university system in a little different light than most other organizations are, or probably all other organizations that are funded through the legislature. And so I think the request is a good one, and I think it's one that we should be very aware of and open to say, yeah, we are going to do things good with the money. I know we feel like that as a group, but our commitment to demonstrate that through some accountability is a good one. And frankly, that's not necessarily a party issue, because I've heard that accountability piece come from both sides of the aisle and the governor's office for the last 8 years, and this governor certainly is not changing the tone on that. What are you going to do with this money if you get it? And how will it be used, and how will it help Montana? Now, ultimately, we know that what is going to drive performance is the faculty and the administrators throughout the system, the great people we have at all of our institutions. And that quality and that performance will be driven at that level. But I think it's also fair, honestly, for us to ask that as a board, to say, we want to have the best system we can, and for us to demand performance and ask for it and to demonstrate that, I think is very fair on all levels. And so we did an addendum to the cap that all members of the committee signed, I'm very proud to say, which includes ours, D's, Senate, House, that said we're going to start identifying some of this money to be used towards some performance measures. And Senator Brown did a joint resolution that really looks at some of the things that are in Complete College America, and it's not by coincidence that they're here tomorrow. The Vice President of Complete College America is here tomorrow to discuss some of those issues with us, but to start looking at what it is that we're going to use to measure performance. So we can both at the interim committee level and next session at the legislature say, okay, you entrusted us with hard-earned, hard-fought state dollars, and what have we done with those state dollars to make good on our promise that we would make use of those funds in a prudent way for Montana. And I think those two things combined will go a long ways. The resolution sort of drives the measurement piece of it, but the addendum to the cap really sets out that we will use and dedicate part of the funds that we receive as our present law adjustments to say those will be used for performance measures. And so, where this is not a new conversation of the Montana University system, it certainly starts to put some weight behind it, and it absolutely now creates an accountability link, which I think is essential, and candidly I think has been missing to some extent. We get handed money, we say thank you, we'll do good things, we walk away, and credit to the legislature, they've trusted in that for a long time, and I don't think the trust is necessarily broken there, but it's going to be easier for everyone involved, for the legislators, for us to go to them and them to go back to their constituents and say, see, they are doing good things and they are measuring themselves, and we're driven toward those measurements that will ultimately help Montana achieve its goals of having more people with college degrees, which is lots of what we're about. And so I think the addendum did a good thing. I think there's a very important, it's only 3 sentences long. The second one, though, says that the MUS will help develop or will develop and design and implement the metrics that are used to help drive these measures toward higher completion and faster time to degrees, things that are very important to us and to our partners. And so I think we've got it set up right with the legislature. I think there's good support for it. Ultimately, that sort of stands behind our present law adjustments. And so I think we're in a good spot moving forward. And I think we've built some bridges there that will be very important for not only this session, but I hope sessions moving forward, where we can come back and demonstrate that we are doing the good work that we not only know internally we're doing, but that national indicators from all levels, CHEO, AHEC, I mean, there's a long list of people that study higher education across this country that says Montana is an extremely efficient system that's doing a good job and has got to be one of, if not the best value in the country. There's good things happening in Montana, and I am not a bit afraid to demonstrate the good things that we're doing, to be accountable back to the legislature and the taxpayers that sent them there with the state dollars. And so I'm really excited about where we're headed with this. It is in appropriations this week. The decisions, amendments to House Bill 2 will come on Monday. And once that wraps up, if we come out of it where we hope we will, which is intact from where the subcommittee left it, then it will be on the House floor and ultimately gets transmitted to the Senate toward the end of this month. So that is really kind of where we're at on the cap addendum, the joint resolution that Senator Brown's put forward. If there's any questions on that, we can. I know everybody's wondering, well, what does that mean, performance funding? And so we're going to have Tyler spend a few minutes talking about sort of what the first round will mean and what the second round will mean. They're probably different. One of the things we discussed with the two senators is this is coming fairly close to what is the beginning of our biennium. And so, we've got to get things in place before we can start to measure and award funds based on performance. And so I think this first piece will move fast. The second piece will hopefully be thorough and be well-designed, including a large number of stakeholders when we get back to the 2015 session. But Tyler, go ahead.
Thank you, Commissioner. Members of the board, good morning. We have a document here that starts to answer some of the questions about performance-based funding. Anytime you say performance-based funding in higher education, it is followed by a litany of questions: who, what, when, where, and why. This will start to paint some of the flavor of that. I do not pretend that I have every one of those answers. We will find the answers to those, but the question of why has to be unequivocal. And I think you heard from Commissioner Christian a little bit about that why. And he talked about the college affordability plan. We have a link there to this in this document, the performance funding addendum, the planning that has occurred throughout our system since 2009 related to performance funding, links to all those. But that gets us down to the driving forces behind performance funding, this new round of performance funding in higher education called Performance Funding 2.0. And that's related to, first and foremost, increasing the percent of the population with a higher education credential, moving the dial in terms of the number of students that we're able to get through the system with meeting critical momentum points and receiving credentials that they can then take into the workforce that ensures that we have a competitive nation and, for us, a competitive state. Those goals were set forth first by the President, and then most recent for us, Governor Bullock in his State of the State mirrored that goal by saying he wanted to increase the percent of the population in Montana that has a higher education credential from 40 to 60% over the next decade. What begs the question there is, what is the MUS going to do to ensure that this happens? And this begins to lay that out. Running simultaneous to that discussion, and as a driver of it, is Complete College America. We're going to have a presentation by the Vice President of Complete College America tomorrow on just exactly what is that program and why have 32 states joined it? Why have they adopted a completion agenda? Why have they followed the steps or working on following the essential steps that I've listed there of setting a state goal, setting individual campus completion goals, adopting uniform measures and progress, shifting to performance-based funding, in an effort to reduce time to degree, accelerate success, transform remediation, and restructure our higher education delivery system for today's students. That is key to this conversation. And Regent Teal said something this morning that just resonated, and it probably hit the nail right on the head. And that is, we cannot separate the goals from the outcomes or the performance model. And that is abundantly clear in how you design something as controversial or as detailed as a performance funding model. Now, the Commissioner mentioned Senate Joint Resolution 13. I'm not going to open that bill up, but I suggest that you all do that because it encourages us to do just that. And it says that we will return, the Montana University system will set specific goals by July 2014 to increase college completion rates and develop a state action plan for increasing college completions. Embedded in that is performance-based funding. That's one of the primary strategies related to this. So all this material in this document I've kind of put together as just a foundation for referencing where we're at and some of the primary documents related to this process. So if you scroll down a little bit, Amy, let's talk about the process. The addendum to the cap says that in FY15 we will allocate half of our present law adjustments, our inflationary costs that hopefully we receive from the legislature to performance funding. So that then begs the question, how are we going to get to that? Well, first and foremost, we're going to use nationally recognized best practices. We're banking on the experts to help us in this endeavor, and there is a wealth of information out there. From our own faculty that we have here in Montana to the administrative leaders throughout the system, to some of the primary consultants that we use, including Complete College America, there is a playbook. And I think on note number 2, top of the list on the playbook, this process has to be inclusive. You have to bring everyone along in it, and that's a tough task. And when we say we have to have this in place to allocate funds in FY15, that means we have to move fast and we have to move now. We have to have what campuses are going to be measuring on, what is driving the performance in place at least a year before we allocate those funds, which means by July 1, or if not sooner, the May board meeting, that first set there, the FY15 related to that 50% of our inflationary costs, that performance, I hesitate to even call it a model at the beginning, that performance foundation has to be put in place. And that's why we're describing this as a 3-step process. Step 1, working with representatives throughout our system and our campuses, representatives from the faculty, representatives from the finance area, representatives from the data, representatives from the regents need to work together in a small group to bring back at the May meeting what that model will look like. I've already started working to devise this group and lay out what it is that's ahead of us. And what bogs down performance-based funding is when you leave the notion of keep it simple. It has to be simple, and it really has to be simple for the FY15 model. That's the foundation of what we create going forward, which are steps 2 and 3. They relate back to what we're going to hopefully do with Complete College America or some other completion agenda that sets out those goals to increase completions, designs the type of progress and outcome metrics, and I really emphasize progress because throughout performance-based funding, it's not necessarily just measured on reaching a goal. It's measured and funds are allocated on making progress. And that is the inclusive process that we intend to undertake throughout the next 2 years, that following the FY15 model year, we will be poised to take a step further with performance funding in FY16 and 17 based upon this collaborative approach. Mr. Commissioner, members of the board, that concludes my report. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Regent. Thank you, Mr. Trevor. Are there questions or comments from members of the board?
Angela?
Regent Teal.
Yeah. First of all, I just wanted to say I would be really interested in participating in that process. I know I've already communicated that to you, but I wanted to communicate it to all of you. I've talked to a good number of faculty on campuses, on the MSU campus largely, who are concerned about performance funding. But I think that it's pretty clear that it's a good direction for us, especially if we can create a process that's inclusive enough, that ensures that we have some more contrarian views. And I think that because of that, the one request I might ask is that when we come back in May, we also think about articulating the process that we want to use over the next 2 years in greater detail. I think this is a great start, but the color that I'd like to add to this conversation is about our planning process. I think that over the next 2 years, in order so that we don't divorce goals and metrics, so that we don't let metrics drive our goals, but are rather setting goals and then deriving the metrics that we think would best fit those goals. I think it's really important that we take a comprehensive look at our strategic plan. I'd really like that to be a part of the process over the next 2 years.
Thank you, Regent Teal. Questions or comments from other members of the board? Regent Krause?
You know, I guess you don't expect the CPA of the group to get all theoretical, but I'm going to get a little theoretical here for a few minutes. Thank you for your indulgence, Madam Chairman. First of all, I want to say that performance funding can't take the place of the formula funding side of it. I mean, we have to have both of those in place, or, you know, on the inputs and the outputs both. But it is a great measure of quality and moving towards a goal. But I think we need to make sure that we have that stable funding so that the faculty and the campuses understand what we're trying to do with the performance side. And it could be that grows, you know, as a percentage of what we're doing, but I think it's important to not use performance funding as a way of shrinking up the pie, the funding. So thank you to the senators for maintaining that idea. We're talking about these pretty specific strategies and specific objectives, and sometimes I think we don't understand why is that a good thing. You know, we're all here for higher education, and over the last couple of 100 years, I think higher education has changed a lot. We've kind of moved away from the more or less, you know, pre-Enlightenment university, and you know, suddenly Jefferson and everyone else started these secular universities. They were made available to a larger group of people. The land-grant universities significantly changed that. We moved into two-year education. So we've seen a huge change in sort of the university as an idea over the last couple of centuries. And why is that? And I think it has something to do with what it is we really are trying to task the university system with doing. And it's not just pushing more people through the pipe. It is actually something, I don't want to say world peace, but you know, it is pretty high. It's I was going to start with world peace, but I kind of backed off. You know, I think our overall goal is to improve our citizens' lives and our society as a whole with higher education, and we all buy into this idea that higher education is probably the best way to do that. That 60% or higher of the populace of the adult populace of Montana having some kind of post-secondary education will improve the lives of citizens throughout the state, in every little town and every big town and all around. And so we need to have, in some ways, I think we have to have a little bit higher goal than you know, this idea that we're going to get more people through the pipe. You know, I do think individual opportunity is improved with post-secondary education completion, and that individual finding their place in the world, and you know, to pay taxes and not consume them, and this is our best chance to strike at that idea. I think about the years I've been involved with the College of Technology in Great Falls and Bozeman all the way through Gallatin College, and there was a time not very long ago when we were 50th out of 50 in engagement of students over traditional age in the university system. It wasn't that long ago. And we have a hard time when we get in front of the legislators making a case for money if we're not impacting a broader spectrum of society. So we probably don't have to start the conversation with you know, improve society, but the reason that I start there has a lot to do with a couple of the things that I don't see on here, but our strategies as well towards that goal, rather than you know, just how many people that go through, and that is I think we need to see more participation from low income and first time attendees out of a family that go to the university system that get some kind of degree. To me, we're burrowing down on that level, like here's Montana's population, how do we get more of those people? And there's more to it than just you know, the ones that get here get out, and there's also get more of them in. And so when we go to these small towns, when they say, why should I send money to Bozeman or Missoula? We have a great answer for them, that the students in your high school, the adults that just lost their job, they're getting impacted, they're improving their lives, and we're helping them do it. And so it is a bit more than just those goals. I understand why we want to do those right away, but if we kept in our minds a little bit higher goal, like improves Montanans overall, improve society, make impactful changes to our entire populace, then I think we may come up with some other significant goals in there that are metrics for that success. And I just want to say to my colleagues, you're standing on the high hill of the Board of Regents, and you're able to see farther and you're able to see wider because you've been elevated to this position. And you can use this position to look backward and to look down, or you can use this position to look out and to see the future and lead the state towards that. And I would urge you all to, as touchy-feely as that might be, I would urge you all to use that position and that vision to move this forward, the little bit and the whole lot, both forward.
Thank you, Regent Kraus. Further questions or comments from members of the board? Regent Buchanan.
I guess it should be no surprise that this related to incorporating performance-based funding into our planning process is exciting to me. I mean, from the moment I've been on this board, we've been flirting with how to integrate it. And one thing that I keep hearing in our good conversation with faculty this morning is historically it's been moving money from within our existing budget to find it. And this is so different. This is new money. And as a percentage of our overall budget, I don't at all consider this a penalizing approach. This is very much an incentive-based approach. We are working to say collectively, and I want to speak to it a little bit, the partnership with the legislature, here's a goal that we can align on, and let's use resources to get there. And so I hope it's not perceived as threatening. It should not be. It is going to do exactly what I think Regent Kraus is articulating, helping us go through our large list of priorities, picking one or two very simple ones, and providing resources to help us move the dial in that direction. Related to the process, and I think that we've got something to feel very good about that's occurring during this legislative session. And this is a tip of the hat to Senator Brown and your colleagues on the committee, Senator Wanzenreed. As I look at all of the agreements and discussions that are occurring, this cap is about the only thing where a real solid agreement sits at this stage of the session. We know it's not done. Advocacy is going to continue to be needed to continue to move it forward, but there's a solid agreement that's bipartisan. It's executive branch legislature, the MUS. This is a fantastic point to find ourselves in this process, especially relative to the other discussions that are being had. There's not near as much progress with some of the other budgetary discussions out there to date. And I think it's important to nod to Commissioner Christian's leadership there. I mean, you're getting the job done, Clay, and keep it up. The job's not done. Let's keep this advocacy moving forward so that we can get it done. And the final thing I think, and as I look at this Complete College America, if Mr. Trevor has not already passed out that 12-page, 13-page document that kind of outlines the approach to all of the regents get it to us, I couldn't agree more with the approach. And as Joe has articulated, we're going to have to expedite it. And it ain't going to be perfect this time around, but as we integrate a planning process to ensure that this type of partnership with the legislature and this type of partnership with the executive branch can continue to be built upon, the thoughtfulness of approaching that document is hitting the nail on the head. I think it's a very appropriate tool there. As we think about creating this task force or this group to look at it, I'm glad Joe's articulate, or Regent Teal's articulating an interest. I think Regent Kraus is well suited to be a participant there. Would encourage him to express interest in it. I want to extend an invitation to Senator Brown and your committee and Senator Wanzenreed to the broader legislature to participate. We are making great ground in working not as you and it's us now. And the leadership that you've already provided to elevate this conversation and resources behind it, I think that the learning opportunities for members of your body to be a part of that discussion are huge and would give us the opportunity at the next session to not start as ground zero with term limits and the turnover related to elections. If we can have members, both from the governor's office and from the legislative body, to help us get through this process, participate, and take that learning to the next session, I think what we'll find is very much like we found with transferability. Here's a deliverable. here's what we've learned, here's where we see the next opportunity, and collectively we agree that this is the way we want to move forward. So not only would I love to hear any thoughts that you two might have as far as this process has gone thus far, I certainly know that as I've talked with other members of this board, your participation is highly anticipated and requested as we move this process forward, and we're very appreciative for that collaborative nature. And I know that I'm committed, and sense that our board is committed to continue to do what it takes to keep that collaboration in place. And I think working together in this planning process is a very good start to continue that. So many thanks to you all.
Thank you. Mr. Renz.
Thank you, Chairman McLean. I don't think the faculty are opposed to performance-based measures, but I keep thinking that if I were the chief operating officer of a company called upon to increase its output, what would I do? I would add or renovate equipment. I would add a second shift, which means a commitment of resources. The university system, however, is in a situation right now where we are in a negative position in terms of human resources. That's a result of a number of factors. The most influential factor has been the level of funding that the system has received over the past several biennia. And here's the result. At Montana State University, where we graduate engineers and architects, disciplines in which math plays an important part, the math department has been suffering a 25 to 30% vacancy rate for a number of years. That's no small vacancy. At the University of Montana, the vacancy within the history department is at 25% and has been for quite some time. You can take American history at the University of Montana, so long as it's after 1800, because we don't have a specialist before that period. It's probably important in today's world to know something about China, the third largest economy, to know something about Korea, which is currently rattling its nuclear sabers, to know about Japan, one of the regional powers. But at the University of Montana, we do not have a specialist to teach Asian history, and that vacancy has existed for a number of years. We have not had an American foreign policy specialist at the University of Montana for nearly 20 years. At my own law school, we had vacancies in tax, vacancies in environmental law. We conducted recruiting efforts, and we were unable to fill those positions the first go-round. And these conditions occur at a time when we have high unemployment and people looking for jobs. And what's the reason? It comes down to a simple thing. University of Puerto Rico boasts of beautiful beaches and nice weather when there are no hurricanes. It also boasts of a higher salary than we pay at the University of Montana. And that is true for every other public university in the United States. That means that when we are recruiting faculty, we are competing against every other university, and we are competing poorly. That's why we have these vacancies. Prospective faculty are not stupid. Otherwise, they wouldn't be prospective faculty. They can see the handwriting on the wall. They can see the lines in the sand. They can see that if they come to the University of Montana or to Montana State, they will have to pay a sacrifice, a financial sacrifice. They can look at our pension system, and they can see that among the Big Sky Conference, the contributions from the state are the lowest of all the schools in the conference. They can look at our pension system and realize that every member of the optional retirement plan pays a tax to support the teacher's retirement system that comes directly out of their pocket. This makes it very, very difficult for us to hire competent faculty. It's not just a question of the best and brightest, but competent faculty. Until we can fill these holes, we may have difficulty reaching and satisfying performance-based goals. Now, performance-based funding is tied to House Bill 2. We understand that, but there's still House Bill 13. And as you consider and argue in favor of House Bill 13, remember, we have enormous holes that we cannot fill because we cannot be competitive in the market.
Thank you, Mr. Renz. I don't think it can be understated or underscored how this board ranks the recruitment and retention of faculty and staff across the system as our top priority. We recognize that in order to most positively impact student learning, we must be aggressive in those efforts. And I opened up today with my remarks in that regard, and I spoke to the efforts being made to provide this board with a roadmap in regards to addressing most effectively the issues of compression and inversion. And that would be in addition, I believe, to whatever House Bill 13 would yield. I think that we need to be aggressive, and I think we need to do something across the system to address the issues that you mentioned. So I wanted to open up my remarks in regards to performance funding with that. I do have another couple of statements that I'd like to add just in respect specifically to the performance funding conversation. I think it is indeed an extraordinary time and a historic time for the Montana University system. And I do credit our lawmakers up at the Capitol for their efforts to reach across the table to folks on the other side of the aisle, and for their efforts to work with us and with the governor's office in a very collaborative fashion. It is very historic. As we move forward, I think that the performance funding conversation is a very exciting one, and I think that it's one that we can get to a point even by May where we can have conversations about what this is going to look like over the course of the biennium, and we as a board will have a better understanding about the metrics and the expectations, et cetera. So I think we can get there. At the same time, I would caution us all in this regard to make sure that we are cognizant of potential unintended consequences. And I've heard this. I heard Regent Krause speak to it. We spoke about it this morning at the faculty meeting. I think we need to make performance funding work for all of our students. In so many of the conversations, we speak to decreasing time to degree, and so many of the efforts where we would focus our resources are students who would already get there anyway. And we need to make sure that those who need our resources the most aren't unintentionally harmed by our efforts. Additionally, I would ask us as we move forward, ask Mr. Trevor, as we move forward to move the conversation along and make sure that we include provisions that reward success with underserved populations. I think it is important as we move forward that we have that buy-in from the faculty and staff. We hear your comments, Mr. Renz, loudly and clearly, and we recognize, I think as a board, I know the Commissioner's Office recognizes that none of this takes shape in a successful fashion unless we have buy-in from our faculty and staff across the system. And so that is the first place that we're going to start. And then finally, I would just ask as we move forward that we make sure that we include certificate programs in the conversation in regards to performance funding. I look forward to the opportunities to have further conversations. I'm grateful for those opportunities to have those conversations, and I think that they're going to be able to shape the lives, Mr. Krause, of the students that we serve in many ways. So I thank all at the table for their efforts in moving the conversation forward. Are there other questions or comments? President Engstrom.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I just want to emphasize on behalf of the affiliation that we want to be enthusiastic participants in this discussion. This is not something that we're entering into in a reluctant sense. We're entering into it in an energetic sense. It is clearly a national trend, an important national level discussion. If you look at the strategic plans of each of the institutions, certainly in the affiliation, I'll let President Cruzado speak for the MSU affiliation, every one of them has student success at the heart of those strategic plans. And so the movement from the below 40% level to the 60% level is foremost on all of our minds. And certainly there are serious questions to be asked and answered, and Professor Rentz has put some of those before us. But I do want to say we had a good discussion last night among the affiliation on this topic, and there is enthusiasm for entering that discussion and reaching a formula, an approach that makes sense for us, that takes into account all of the concerns, but that in the end moves the dial in the direction of more graduates from the University of Montana affiliation. So I just wanted to say that clearly. We are enthusiastic participants in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, President Engstrom. President Cruzado.
Madam Chair and members of the board, I also want to say that the same is true in the Montana State University campuses. Yesterday we also had a meeting, and all the campuses of our system are very energized about how can we collaborate, and moreover, how can we be creative, use this time not to do the same thing that we have been doing and obtaining the same results, but how can we communicate a message that for our families in Montana, that they have in front of them a roadmap, that a student in Montana can have an advantage when they consider our two-year programs and how that can be used as a jumping start, as an opportunity for better and bigger opportunities. They can complete a two-year certificate in our colleges, and then they can transfer to our wonderful campuses. They can start in one campus and then transfer to another that better meets their needs and the needs of their families. So we are thinking in a very 360 type of way and trying to walk a mile in the shoes of our students, their parents, and their families who put all their faith and effort behind the Montana University system. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions or comments from members of the board?
Madam Chair,
Regent Williams.
I would associate myself with the remarks of the chair, particularly with regard to the importance of faculty engagement in the development of this promising effort, and it has great promise. But I would remind the board that if we want the faculty in on the landing, we got to get them on board in the takeoff. They've got to be on board in the whole trip, and they have to help guide the mission. They have to help guide the flight. Now, I think the board has had 3 briefings now, if I'm right, on performance-based funding, and some of us have talked with each other about it. For my part, I like the procedures that we will follow to arrive at goals. And what I like best about them is that they are going to be there's going to be considerable local engagement, which means at the institutional level, and that will involve, of course, the various CEOs of our good universities and colleges, and will involve the faculty. I particularly attach myself to what the faculty representative has said here today. Let's face it, something we all know and we all do face, and that is, in this room today, or any room where education is discussed, the people closest to the students are always the faculty. And as we have heard today, just a couple of minutes ago from the faculty representative, they are also, in my opinion at least, the ones who best understand the shortfalls, the uncomfortable truths about the difficulties in our university system. It's not easy to hear those truths, as it was not easy to listen to some of what Jeff had to say today, but it's very important. And we need people on board during this important flight who can remind us of those shortfalls. And in so reminding us, improve our understanding that the goals are fine, but there are many, many hurdles to which we must pay attention and try to correct along the way to those goals. So, my colleagues and Madam Chair, I think that the majority, in fact, is the unanimous opinion of this board, I think, is that the faculty must be involved. Now, that places responsibility on the faculty. And I know that the faculty representative here today has taken that responsibility, and we are assured that he will do what he can to ready the Montana University System faculty for their coming role in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Williams. Regent Teal.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to just comment on Regent Williams' comments. I think that we all know that performance funding has the capacity to be very constructive. It also, if we don't approach it in the correct manner, has the capacity to be pretty destructive. You know, there are potential unintended consequences, and that is where we really need help from faculty, and we need processes that include faculty. Unfortunately, one thing we also know is that for the 2015 biennium, we're going to have kind of a quick and dirty process. And I think that entering into that, it's important to go with the idea of do no harm. Let's move forward. We have obligations and agreements that we're entering into, but we should go with that with the concept that we want to have over the next 2 years a very inclusive, constructive process so that faculty members can bring to light those areas that we maybe as not professional educators don't have a complete understanding of. I did want to give Mr. Trevor a chance to maybe come up and just walk us through your concept of this quick and dirty process for the next couple months. Are there directions that we should be providing, or how do you envision that happening?
Madam Chair, Regent Teal, yeah, thanks for that opportunity. And by the way, you were already on the group before you volunteered. So the process obviously has been pretty, I mean, the thoughts around the process have been fairly fluid, as is the agreement with the CAP. But we know this, we need to act quickly, we need to have representation from the primary constituents throughout the system. We need to be able to digest, that group needs to be able to digest some of the best practices around the nation, and in a very skeletal manner and simple approach. I'm just adamant in the fact that this needs to relate to the completion agenda and increasing completions. And once you adopt that idea, the rest of it seems to flow in, I don't want to say a simple manner, but it reduces the complexity. That we know that what we're after is increasing completions, and that the measures of those are finite, and that there are some fairly 30,000 foot metrics we could employ in FY15 that would do exactly what you say, no harm. Because the funds that are related there are to basically additional funds on top of our budget, and not in incredibly large amounts. We're in the process of putting together the team as we speak, and I would take and open to anyone in this room input on that, and by the beginning of next week we will start the actual work.
Thank you. And here's just the one other piece I wanted to interject. I think Regent Williams had a really good point about our process is so important. over the next couple of years. And there's one thing that's troubled me for a while about our process here, just as a board, is that we tend to have mission creep as a board. We ask a lot, and we don't often necessarily hold in our minds at one time all of the barriers and challenges. And one piece of evidence for that is that while we have a strategic plan that it does guide the strategic plans all the way down through the system, it's not something that we have, I think, a good process to look at comprehensively. So we look at one plank at a time, typically to add a plank. And because of that, we end up with a plan that's descriptive and not strategic. And I think that this is really an opportunity to take a look at that process as a board, so that when we are talking with faculty, and when we're instructing presidents, when we're talking to our commissioner, it's clear what our priorities are. And so I think that to accomplish that, we need to have a process by which we comprehensively look at our strategic plan and put forward something that's more strategic and less descriptive. And I'm hoping that out of this performance-based funding conversation will come a conversation about how we can accomplish that in a manner that's inclusive both of our partners in the legislature and also is heavily a representative of faculty, so that the quality of the education we provide is also protected.
Thank you, Regent Teal. You're right on. And subsequent to our conversation the other day on the phone, I did visit with Regent Trevor for the day about revisiting the entire strategic plan, and as well as the success agenda, and using the framework provided by Complete College America to help redesign it. So that is certainly on his radar. It's on our radar as a board. And so I look forward to those efforts. Now, folks, on our agenda, we have the CAP resolution. And at this point, I would entertain a motion to affirm the resolution.
So moved.
Thank you. A motion has been made to affirm the CAP resolution. Are there any questions and comments from the board? Is there any public comment? Any public comment? Any public comment? Okay, a motion has been made to approve the CAP resolution. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. The motion carries. The CAP resolution has been approved. Back to you, Mr. Commissioner.
Madam Chair, thank you for that. The resolution will be another important sign from this body of its support of both the CAP and the addendum to the CAP as we move forward through the process. Moving on, House Bill 2 also contains what we have referred to over the last couple of years as our system initiatives. I think you all are fairly familiar with them. I just want to give you a quick update of where those stand at this point in time. One of our initiatives, of course, is the universal enrollment. That was presented at subcommittee level. At this point in time, there's been no motion on that. There are, I'm aware of amendments that may or may not be presented to restore that funding at the Monday appropriations hearing, but at this point in time remains unfunded. I guess I would say I think there's a lot of interest on behalf of the subcommittee in that item. There's a lot of direction given to us, that certainly concurrence that that's where we need to go. At the same time, recognizing the subcommittee has a substantial task ahead of them of balancing state funds, and this is a good idea that is unfunded at this time, and we'll just see where it goes as we move through the process. Student assistance for the WWAMI positions, what came out of committee is 5 slots funded. We had asked for 10. Certainly willing to accept those 5 if that's how it continues to move forward in appropriations. We have had some conversations around adding the other 5 back in. I don't know exactly where that will end up. Again, I think great support for what we're trying to do, and the importance of medical professionals in our state was not wasted on the committee. There's enough gray hair in the committee that they all appreciate good medical care, and so I think the support will continue. It's purely getting out of committee balanced, and that was something that I certainly respect, a job the committee has to do. The veteran success, I think sort of interesting, there were several motions on it, one at a lower amount that failed because many on the committee wanted at a higher amount, and then there's a motion for it to be funded at the full amount, which failed because many on the committee wanted it somewhere in between, and that's kind of where it stands right now. I think there's also amendments that may restore some or part of all that funding. The workforce development, two-year education, as you know, continue to support, I think, the incredible momentum we have in two-year education and also sort of the historic changes that two-year has seen in Montana and will continue to see. Support of that, we'd asked for $1 million in each year of the biennium. It came out of committee at $500,000 of each year of the biennium, which will be a good start toward continuing those efforts. The veterinary medicine, which of course is the startup for a vet med cooperative program, first year at Montana State University, and then the cooperative piece with Washington State University, passed out of committee, fully funded. The I guess that's sort of what passed out in terms of other House Bill 2 items, and then in addition, there were some amendments that were added to House Bill 2 on our behalf. Egg experiment station funding to the tune of about $1 million has been put in. Increased funding for extension service for $800,000 over the biennium has been put in. A very important piece, something that we'd originally asked for to be included in House Bill 2 for various reasons. I think it was included, but maybe in a different section. Was brought back. I think Senator Brown brought this amendment back, but is to provide the $200,000 funding each year of the biennium for the additional residency slots in Billings, and that is passed out of committee, fully funded. And the last is a local government center at Montana State University, $200,000 in each year of the biennium. So overall, we are funded relatively close to where the governor had requested. They are in a little bit different categories given the additions that I just read, the last 4 additions, and then not funding the couple items that we talked about, the big one being the universal enrollment, which is $5 million. Overall, I think we're funded around $2.5 or $3 million below what our request was. But the other various pieces of House Bill 2 were also funded, some present law adjustments for OCHI and the present law adjustments for the community college, other pieces that are incorporated within House Bill 2 for us also came out fully funded. And so, again, our thanks to the committee for the work that they did. I think we sit in fairly good shape as we move forward. I think the cap has played an integral part in that, as we discussed in length. And I think we have good direction moving out. So that is sort of where we sit on the system initiatives. Long-range building has moved out of subcommittee as well. Was heard a few weeks ago and is awaiting its turn in line in appropriations. Probably sometime next week or the week after that will happen. The list remains relatively unchanged to what we thought the list was at the November meeting, and I think we went through that sufficiently where I don't need to go through line item at a time, including the general authority that we need for the authority-only projects, Jazz Building, Athletic Center in Missoula, Gilkey Building in Missoula, and some library commons additions. That's what came out of committee. We moved some numbers around, but this board was aware of those number moves. It's where we thought the numbers were originally, so some of those things that weren't lining up exactly as we thought have been corrected through the amendments, and that bill moves forward as well, where we thought it would and where we hoped it would. And so, all in all, I guess that's where we are in the legislative session. Certainly hard to recap inside of a few moments what the process is and the entirety of the session, but very encouraged by the partnerships that we're building with legislators on both sides of the aisle, very encouraged by the governor's willingness to seemingly work on both sides of the aisle. I know the only thing we've asked was the addendum, and there was great willingness both by the governor and both parties to say, yeah, how can we come together and help fund higher education and yet meet some of our goals at the same time. So I guess in my position, very pleased with the process of the session and where we sit at this point in time. And I think Angela mentioned it to start. There's a lot of work yet to be done and certainly a lot of obstacles ahead, but we're doing what we can do to move forward at this time. There's other on there, and I don't remember what other was. So if I'm supposed to talk about something else, somebody's got to remind me. No? Okay. Well then, Madam Chair, I believe that wraps up the Commissioner's report, the legislative report. The campus reports, as you know, we post for everyone's reading pleasure. And there's another other, which I don't think I know the answer to that one either. So I will turn the mic back over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. And on that other, then I think we will break now until 10:35. Budget Committee, I would like to turn the mic over to the Commissioner who would like to make an introduction.
Two introductions that I've failed to mention earlier. The first is our new Chief Legal Counsel, who's now here and on board, replacing Kathy Swift after long service to the MUS. Viv Hamill has joined us after years of service in state government as an attorney. Will represent you all in the Montana University system as our Chief Legal Counsel. And so we welcome Viv to the team. Thanks for being here. The other announcement, I have some sick, sadistic pleasure in telling you that John Seck's not here today because of a good snow ski wipeout that has him in surgery this afternoon. And I'm sure he's watching, so it's good that we gave him a little bit of a hard time. We decided to get the Ironman Award for showing up to work yesterday and even covering for me at Carroll College, speaking on a panel that I was supposed to and couldn't. So he does get some credit for that, especially when our dear friend Kevin McCrae was out with a little sneezy kind of common cold. No, we're not going to let that go. So I apologize for having to air all of this Commissioner Office, inter-office politics on the microphone, Madam Chair, but it's good to keep everyone intact.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. And I think based on the ski wipeout comments, I think it is very appropriate that I turn it over to the Chancellor of Montana Tech for the first the first couple of budget items on our budget agenda.
Thank you, Chair McLean. Yes, I am also recovering from surgery from a ski accident, so it's good to be here. I feel the pain for Deputy Commissioner Seck. We have actually 3 items on the Budget and Audit and Oversight Committee, and I'm basically here to answer questions. I'll just work my way down through them. The operating agreement between the Montana Tech Foundation and Montana Tech is on there. This is something that I believe we've worked through the Commissioner's office. Were there specific questions? I had sort of expected that to be on the consent agenda, and I don't see it there, but were there questions about that agreement that were out of the ordinary? Okay. And then the second item on the agenda that relates to Montana Tech is the Alumni Coliseum lease. This is an agreement also that we have worked through the Commissioner's office to establish an agreement that would allow the foundation to install turf in the Alumni Coliseum. We have raised the funds for that from private sources. It's a long line of commitments that our foundation board makes. They're very focused when they make commitments. They've focused on the NRB to raise $2 million for that building. They've raised money for the Hyper Complex over the years. They've raised money for the University Relations Center. This turf project is something that we need. Surprise to most people, not a lot of ability to grow grass in Butte, Montana, and this particular renovation of our Coliseum will make it so that we can use that facility on a year-round basis for much more than just football. Our club rugby teams, our lacrosse teams, our intramural soccer teams will all be able to use that. It will save us money on wear and tear on our other grass fields. Spring football's coming up, and we never know how much we're going to have to pay for repairing our grass fields once spring football is over. So I would ask that you would approve that as well. Are there questions on that?
Thank you, Chancellor Blackketter. Both of these are action items, and so let's begin with action item A, the operating agreement between
I'm sorry.
Montana Tech and the Tech Foundation. Are there any questions or comments from members of the board? What's that? We are, yes. Yeah. Yeah, and we will move these items to, we're just discussing the items today, and we will move them to the action part of the agenda tomorrow. And now we'll move on to action item B. Are there any questions for Chancellor Blackketter or comments in regards to action item B? Okay. All right, thank you,
Thank you.
Chancellor.
And I do have H. Would you want me just to stay here and finish the easement? The approval to grant easement for...
Please do.
It's a simple thing. It's a gas easement that goes along a property line for our Highlands campus. It's a building that the students built about 5 years ago and are as an educational project. And instead of heating that with electricity, we want to heat it with natural gas. And so it provides an easement along a border and directly to that building. There's a plan in the attachments and such. Were there questions on that? I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
Anyone have questions or comments regarding action item H? Okay,
Thank you.
then these items will move
Thank you.
to tomorrow's agenda. Thank you. Now we will look to the next item on our agenda, item C, and I will turn to Terry Least for a conversation in that regard.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board. This item is, as allowed by Montana Code, MSU seeks your approval for leasing the property at the stadium to the MSU Alumni Foundation for the purposes of upgrading the parking facilities at that site and to execute the necessary work through the foundation. This project is expected to improve about 400 or more spaces, which is currently unpaved, essentially just gravel and dirt area. Project funding for this will be from non-state funds, gifts, in-kind donations, and no student fees, and construction of the project will not take place until we have all of the funding in place. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Thank you, Mr. Least. Are there questions or comments from members of the board? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Then this too will move on until to tomorrow's agenda. The next item on our agenda is item D, and basically this would establish a board policy for the allocation of dollars to the campuses. And it has enjoyed, I think, tremendous attention and conversation from the campuses, from the commissioner's office, and from the regent level. And so I look forward to the conversation, and for the beginning of that, I would turn to Mr. Robinson.
Madam Chair, thank you, and members of the Regents. This particular policy has been in the developmental stage for, almost a year now, and in discussion for probably a 2-year period. The policy attempts to put in policy framework, an agreement that was developed among the commissioner and the two presidents within the system. And basically it's focused on the allocation of the state funding, the state appropriations for the next 2-year period. The structure of the allocation will use a 3-year average of resident student FTE as the basis of that allocation. That computation, percentage-wise, that would be developed would be multiplied by the dollar amount of the appropriation, and then those amounts would be allocated to the two presidents. The two presidents then would use those dollars and develop an allocation recommendation, recommendation for allocations to their affiliated campuses that would come back to the Board of Regents at the May meeting this year for consideration and possible approval. The lump sum allocation that we do receive from the legislature does have a few elements within the appropriation that would have to be segregated. There are some pass-through funds that are included in that, and I've noted those special distribution items in under the procedures area in E. We do have embedded in that appropriation an amount that would go to the Yellow Bay Research Facility on Flathead Lake. We do have the medical residency funding that is at this point transferred to the Department of Public Health and Human Services, matched with Medicaid dollars, and then transferred to the residency facilities programs, both in Billings and the newly created one in Missoula. We do have a legislative appropriation for legislative audit that will have to be separately pulled from that dollar amount, and also indicated that certain new kind of line item appropriations that we might have in the biennial budget in House Bill 2 would likely and should also be appropriated or distributed separately. For example, a WWAMI expansion or the vet med expansion. For the biennium in which those would be approved, those would be allocated directly to the campus that is involved in those particular programs. So there will be a few special distribution items will have to be removed from the lump before that calculation would be made. But then that would be basically the framework that is intended to be presented within this policy. The other element that was added in terms of language in the policy is item G under the procedures, some generic language regarding performance-based funding. And as that would develop, there would need to be an allocation or a mechanism for determining that portion of the state appropriation that would be subject to the performance-based funding element. So that might be a second tier in terms of that allocation mechanism. So with that, Chair McLean, I would certainly be interested or could answer or try to answer questions on this policy.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Are there questions or comments from members of the board? Regent Tuss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mick, could you please explain, I believe it's item F on the memo. First of all, I want to thank you for reaching out to several board members with respect to this new allocation formula. That was very helpful. I'm still trying to get my head around Board of Regents discretionary funding and perhaps what that means, how much is that, and is that something that this board determines prior to the beginning of the upcoming biennium?
Yes, Regent Tuss, thank you for that question. Every biennium, since I have been with the Office of the Commissioner, there has been a dollar amount that has been removed from the lump sum funding for the educational units, and it has been labeled as Board of Regents discretionary funding. On a biennium basis, the Commissioner of Higher Education will normally work with the regions to identify particular funding issues that may be involved with the Office of the Commissioner, or specific funding issues that the regions would like to target a certain amount of funding toward over a biennium. The dollar amount of that discretionary funding pool has varied over the bienniums. I think in this particular biennium, the total amount is $500,000. It was allocated, I think, $300,000 to the first year of the biennium and $200,000 to the second year. The preceding biennium, I believe the dollar amount for the biennium totaled $300,000. So, for example, one of the small funding pieces that was included in that Region's priority pool for this particular biennium was the fee to pay for the PBS broadcast of the Board of Regents meeting. That was an unbudgeted expenditure for the Office of the Commissioner. It had, as we started that program, it was between legislative sessions, so that funding mechanism in terms of Regents' discretionary funding helped address that particular issue. Another issue within the Office of the Commissioner was the expansion of the role of the individual involved in our American Indian Minority Achievement Program, expanded the position from a 10-month position to a 12-month position. And that was done in cooperation with the governor's office. So those were a couple of examples of some small expenditures within our office that was the target of these funds. So as we move into this next biennium, I will certainly be working with the commissioner on potential funding issues that we may have in our office. And the commissioner, I think, will reach out to you as board members to look to issues that you may have interest in over the next 2-year period that perhaps would be a target of a pool of funding that we refer to as the Board of Regents discretionary funding pool. And the timing of that, one further point, we would normally do that here prior to the May meeting. So it will be, that pool of money will be determined and would be part of the allocation process as we move forward in that determination into the next biennium.
Further questions or comments from members of the board? Regent Kraus.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chairman. So how do we do it now? We're obviously adopting a new system, so how did we do it last year? Or, what are we moving from to? I see what we're moving to. What are we moving from?
Go ahead. This is the first formal policy.
Madam Chair, Regent Kraus, we didn't necessarily have a policy before. In fact, your first board meeting, you asked if we wouldn't create a policy so we wouldn't be shooting from the dark and people would know what to expect and could plan toward that. This is a new policy that we've worked on really since your opening comments. Before, we would reallocate just sort of one shot at a time in terms of we would bring an action item forward. The now infamous rebasing conversation that happened was just purely an action item that didn't follow a policy. We moved money based on FTEs as those things happen. So this policy is really in response to that, to create just that, a policy, so campuses will know what it is they're following and can know what to expect and what to work toward.
Thank you. That's good to know. I think a second question I had was, does this take away the, obviously we could break our own policy, but does this take away the ability of the regents to define how much the lump sum amount is? I mean, if we wanted to pull some out to do something else, would...
Madam Chair, Regent Kraus, I think to Regent Tess's earlier question, that's exactly what happens in item F there.
Okay.
The board could pull something from the lump. This policy actually goes back to even before my time of taking some discretionary funds. But that number is purely set by a board vote when we approve the budgets. It could be any number that you all wanted it to be.
I think the next one I had to do with, let's see, where is it in here? Where he kind of said previous allocation calculations voided. And I get that. Do you feel the need for any smoothing or anything? I mean, if the new calculation of the new biennium blew up, something. Like the new calculation changed radically the funding to a campus. Do you feel the need for smoothing, or?
Madam Chair, Regent Kraus, I think that the policy in itself smooths, because you've
Okay.
got a 3-year running average. What we didn't have before was a smoothing mechanism, and one of the, I guess, criticisms of the rebasing that we did before, the reallocation, was primarily that it was too abrupt. And so the campuses worked out a deal where they phased it in over 3 years. The policy in itself is designed to smooth with the 3-year average. And we did look at a number of averages from 1 to 5 years. 3 years seems to make the most sense, and will smooth out those peaks and valleys to where it's doable for the campuses for planning's sake.
Okay. And then is it 4 years, because you don't have the information for the last year, or is it 3 years, the most current year? In other words, let's say we were doing it right now, we would not know this year what the FTE, or maybe we would, I don't know, but.
Madam Chair, Regent Kraus, we
because
still use
question.
3 years, but this most current year isn't included in the 3 years.
It isn't, yeah. I'm just
We
curious.
will, as we develop the calculation, that 3-year calculation, by the time we get to the calculation in April, we will have final FTE numbers for this particular year. So we will use this year as the most current year, and then the 2 preceding years. So we will use the most current information. In fact, I have, with some estimates into the spring, I have made a brief estimated calculation of how this 3-year average would work. And as I apply that to the appropriations that we have for this biennium, it almost becomes a break even. I think there's $580,000 is the dollar amount that would be transferred from the MSU campuses to the UM campuses for the next biennium. That's based on appropriation for this particular biennium. So I think the dollar amount of any shifting or smoothing is accounted for by the use of that 3-year average.
Okay. That sounds good. And then one last thing for process, and that is we would allocate the funding in a lump sum to the 2 sides of the MUS, and then the presidents would allocate it out, and they would come back to us, and we would sort of second guess their allocations to the campuses, or is that what we would do?
Madam
Love
Chair,
that
Regent
idea,
Kraus,
yeah.
you could second guess what they did. We would probably encourage you not to, but that's been the process that we've employed for a long time, where the campuses, through the flagship institution on each side, build their budgets, and those budgets are allocated out and approved. But that's the way our structure works. That the presidents have oversight for the budgets on each side of the system. Then the chancellors have oversight for their budgets, and that's how they roll up and how they come to the system. The board always has authority to relook, undermine, reevaluate, whatever you want to label that, and that certainly wouldn't change with this policy. But we think it works with how it's worked in the past and will work good going forward.
Well, and that was just, thank you for that answer, Madam Chair, Commissioner. That it's just that it seems a little funny that we're approving the allocation, and then we're approving the president's allocation, and I said it that way because it does seem to leave open the opportunity, sort of ingrain in the institutionalize the opportunity for second guessing rather than sort of taking away the top-down approach a little bit, and pushing the discretion out to the presidents.
Madam Chair, Regent Kraus, we talked about this some at the September meeting when we approved the budget. That's how we've done the process sort of forever, which has been to work on the budgets, build the budgets, approve the allocations, and then once the spending has occurred, come back and approve those final expenditures. So that's kind of the revisit piece. But certainly no interest in undermining and would discourage that I think the president should have that authority, and I guess I've spoken a number of times to say, I believe, maybe it's with my background, but that that's the appropriate way to hand that money out, and then the presidents need to hand that money to their chancellors, and we need to hold the presidents and the chancellors and ultimately the commissioner responsible for how that happens. I think it's impossible for this board to micromanage campus level spending. We need to have some confidence in the process. And I appreciate your question because it does lend to that, but that's how we've always come back and then approved expenditure levels in the past.
Okay. Nick?
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I could just follow up just with a key concept there. There is also a statutory requirement that the Board of Regents must adopt and approve the budget. So obviously, I think this particular component of it is the first step in the development of the operating budget that we see in September. So I believe that the statutory requirement would require the board to take some formal action on the allocation of those funds, and those funds then roll into the operating budgets that become the formal approval of the board at the September meeting.
Okay, thanks.
Further questions or comments from members of the board? Regent Teal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just had a couple of quick questions. One was, in the past, my understanding is one comparison that we made was to a sort of FTE model that was weighted towards costs associated with programs or estimated costs for types of education provided. And I was just wondering if you could dig into a little bit why we decided that this time.
Madam Chair and
Madam Chair, Regent Till, we've used those more in setting tuition than we have in the allocation. We've generally used the FTE model in allocating funds. I don't think we've had a weighted. I don't think we even did in the base plus budgeting per se. We've done our allocations on an FTE. The tuition has certainly had those type of calculations put in, and I guess honestly that's why tuition is different at different institutions across our campus, with somewhat weighting for cost of programs.
Yes, if I could just follow up a little bit with that. As we did spend a lot of time about 3 years ago, it was actually, I think, wrapped into a lot of discussion regarding allocation, but also the performance funding element, and looking at trying to make a relationship in terms of allocating costs, et cetera, and use some data from national data from other states in terms of costs of various disciplines, et cetera. And the more work that we did in terms of that, it all seemed to focus on a percentage that was very, very close to the percentage based on resident FTEs. And so as we developed the rebasing concept for this particular biennium, we did move toward that resident FTE calculation, and it wasn't quite sort of a 50-50, but it was relatively close to that, and very, very close to the previous modeling that had been done in terms of disciplines. And when we talked about disciplines, we were also looking at graduate programs versus 2-year and all of those various cost factors. And so the simple approach that was really not significantly different at all in terms of the allocation would be the resident FTE. And so as we moved forward on the rebasing, we used resident FTE and then phase that in over a 3-year period, where this basically takes a look at the 3-year average of resident FTE and applies it in terms of an allocation. So it seemed that everything that we looked at honed in on this allocation as probably perhaps the fairest and the easiest in terms of a formula.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to say this is something I thought we should have quite a while ago, and I'm really glad that it's coming forward. And I want to thank you, Mick, and Clay, and the presidents for working through all this, because it's really important, I think, that we're predictable as to how we're distributing money, because that's the only way that we send incentives through our funding, is if people know how the decision is made, when it's made, and also, to a certain degree, how this policy has changed, or when we review how the process works. So, thank you.
Thank you, Regent Teal. I think a great productive conversation around this policy, and I think ultimately it gets us where we want to be as a system, and that is basically providing campuses with a roadmap, basically allowing them the opportunity to know what they can expect. And I too want to extend my appreciation to President Cruzado, President Engstrom, and to the Commissioner and his staff for their work in bringing MSU and the University of Montana together to have this conversation and to look at, I think, a number of models. And I had conversations with each of them. They were exploring various models. I think it was the New Mexico model that was the 3-year average. And I think there were very productive conversations around this that were after, of course, the allocation of 2011 state resources. And so I want to commend everybody who had a hand in this and thank them for their efforts in creating what I think will be a good guiding document as we move forward with the process of allocation of state dollars. And I would ask at this time if there are any further questions or comments from members of the board. Okay, then, thank you. Great discussion. At this time, then, we will move this item to tomorrow's agenda for a vote, and I would ask, we are now on to item E of the agenda, and I would ask Terry Least to visit with us about item E.
Yeah.
President Cruzado, sorry. I have
Madam
her
Chair
right
and
here.
members of the board, these are two interrelated items that are brought forward by Montana State University, and I'm very proud to say that they have been elevated to your consideration by the faculty and the students from the College of Business. Actually, one of our student senators, Erica McKay, is with us here today, and Erica has played a very instrumental role in these conversations. As you know very well, alumnus Jake Japps has been a model of what a successful entrepreneur is. Not only that, he's also a model of what a generous alum and a very grateful alum can do. The conversations that we have been having today about performance-based funding, sometimes we fall into the trap thinking about that these are about what we have accomplished up to this moment. But it's really about the future. What are we doing? How are we going to handle? What other resources can we attract in order to build an even better and stronger university system? These two requests are the faculty from the College of Business would like to rename the MSU College of Business and name it the Jake Japps College of Business and Entrepreneurship. It signals the movement towards the future. It signals how to honor the entrepreneurial attitude of one outstanding alum. But I think it's more than that. It's about honoring the entrepreneurial attitudes of every Montanan. The second request, also related, is as we approach the date in which we ask our legislature to approve authority in order to build the new College of Business, we would like to propose that the new College of Business to be named Japps Hall.
Thank you, President Cruzado. Are there questions or comments from members of the board? Thank you, Madam President. We will move that item to tomorrow. The next item on our agenda comes to us from the University of Montana, and with that, I'll turn it over to President Engstrom.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. As most of you know, we have on our campus the Payne Family Native American Center, which is recognized as the first freestanding building dedicated to Native American education in the country. When we built that building a few years ago, we left the garden floor, the basement, unfinished at the time. And due again to the generosity and the initiative of Terry Payne, we are now in a position of building out that floor. We are doing so in honor of Eloise Cabell, the Blackfeet woman who was responsible for the multi-billion-dollar settlement on behalf of Native Americans around the country. Unfortunately, Eloise passed away a little over a year ago. Terry Payne brought to us the idea and a good part of the funding to build out the basement floor, the garden floor, in her honor. So we brought this to you as an information item last fall, and we now want to seek your action, your approval of officially naming that floor the Eloise Cabell Land and Culture Institute. We did have a wonderful ceremony yesterday to kick off the construction of this, pending the approval of the name by you at this meeting. And this will continue to send a major signal to Montana citizens and to the nation, frankly, the values that we have placed on Native American education at the University of Montana. We're very proud of this initiative, very grateful to Terry Payne and his family for getting us started down the road of this wonderful project. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Regent Tuss.
President Engstrom, thank you for doing this. I just think this is a wonderful tribute to a woman that contributed so much to all of us here in Montana, and certainly our Native American citizens in this state. Very fitting. Thank you for doing this.
Mr. Renz.
Unless there are comments from other regents, I'll go ahead. I'm going to take off my MUSFAR hat and put on my chair of the Faculty Senate hat and tell the board that this matter was brought before the Faculty Senate and explained to us thoroughly, and the Faculty Senate unanimously supports the renaming of the basement. I want to add a couple of words about Eloise Cabell and the trust lawsuit. I was approached by a BIA employee back in the 1980s when I was in private practice. Had a look at the potential litigation, and it was enormous. I can't emphasize enough the enormous sacrifice that Eloise Cabell went through to bring this not only to a conclusion, but to an extraordinarily successful conclusion. And naming the Eloise Cabell Land and Culture Institute after and for Eloise Cabell is just a small token of what we ought to do.
Thank you, Mr. Renz. Further questions or comments from members of the board?
Madam Chair, I feel obliged to say a word about this old friend of many of ours, Eloise. I was pleased to have the opportunity as Montana's congressman to work with Eloise in her efforts to bring financial justice to so many thousands of our fellow Native Americans. Eloise exhibited smarts, patience, and determination over a 20-year period. A challenge that in some ways strengthened her, but physically sapped her strength. And as people who have paid attention to the cause that Eloise struggled with and won in the end know, this was an American and a Montanan who really fit that phrase, one of a kind. There was nobody quite like Eloise Cabell. And although I'm not much enamored with the naming of buildings or parts of buildings, I must say if anybody deserves it, it's Eloise Cabell. I thank the President for forwarding this.
Thank you, Regent Williams. President Engstrom.
Madam Chair, just one last comment. Let me thank Jeff Renz and the Faculty Senate for their prompt and unanimous action on this. I also want to thank Dean Chris Comer, our Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, who was very much the person pushing this on the university side. He did a fantastic job, so thank you.
Thank you, President Engstrom. Okay, so then we will move this item as well to tomorrow's agenda. Thank you for that great conversation. Now on to item G, and for the conversation on that, I would look to Chancellor Story.
There we go. This is on. Thank you. This is a pretty simple request to name the renovated fine arts building on our campus for a major benefactor, and I agree with the comments that President Cruzado and President Engstrom have said about the importance of naming buildings for benefactors. Mary Baker Emmerich was a very generous person. She's allowed us to expand our fine arts program so that we're in many areas state-of-the-art, and we're very pleased to recommend this to you.
Thank you, Dr. Story. Are there questions or comments from members of the board? Thank you. Then we will move this item to tomorrow's agenda. The next item on our agenda, we already covered item H, so now we have before us our consent agenda. Are there any items that members wish to pull from the consent agenda? Okay, then we will move the agenda forward, and I would like to let you know, and I will just have Mick visit with you briefly about an addendum to the consent agenda concerning a FEMA grant and the University of Montana Western.
Madam Chair, thank you. And I'm going to maybe ask Chancellor Story also to provide a little more detail regarding this project, but too late to get it on the agenda. We were notified by Western that they will likely be the recipient of a FEMA grant to do some seismic work on Matthews Hall, and we wanted to bring that to your attention at this point with the understanding that we'll probably see an action item in May in terms of this project.
So Matthews Hall is our major residence hall, and some of you probably know we have some seismic instability in the Dillon area. So this is a measure to reinforce that building. Our match is about $300,000. We have saved that in the auxiliary funds. We will bring all of this to you, but it may be true, as Mick said, that we may need to sign some papers before you folks get together again. So this is all a good news thing. Just so you know, we applied for this before. We didn't get it. It was allocated, I'm told, to some of the counties. They didn't come up with a match, and so FEMA has come back to us, and of course we're pleased with that. They've been on our campus. A&E supports this project, but we just wanted to give you a heads up.
Thank you, Chancellor Story, and that will be coming to us in May. My apologies on that. It is an information item in that regard. Thank you, Chancellor Story. So now we will look to Mr. Robinson and President Cruzado for the first item on, the second item on our information agenda for the Collaborative Public Spaces at MSU Bozeman.
And Madam Chair, members of the board, this is simply an example, and just to want to make sure that this is in front of you. As we move through the legislative process, we always have a request for general authority for our campuses within the university system in terms of construction projects. And as the general authority is utilized by the particular campuses, I do like to make sure that the board is aware of those particular projects. This project on the MSU Bozeman campus is regarding some construction of a variety of public gathering and seating spaces that would be within various academic buildings on the campuses, and the dollar amount, $300,000, that would come from the current unrestricted funds of the campus, part of the budgeting of renovation dollars within that particular fund. And so the authority is granted by the legislature in terms of general authority. This is simply an example and a presentation of that particular project.
Thank you. Are there questions or comments from members of the board? Regent Teal.
So this question isn't directly related to this, but we've had a conversation before about how our requirements for campus submittals on the budget agenda is anything over $150,000. And we've discussed perhaps changing that in the past. And I was wondering if there was any comment or idea where we are in that discussion.
Madam Chair, Regent Teal, we absolutely did at our retreat, and that's something, well, we just haven't got to that on our discussion, but it's a very good point. I think it consumes a fair amount of board time for unnecessary items in many regards, and so we'll work, maybe at May, we can bring back a look at least a first round of a policy decision there. Yeah, thank you for the reminder.
Further questions or comments from members of the board? Okay, thank you. And so now we are on to item B of the information agenda, and I would look to Brennan Zach from the University of Montana for a conversation on the Smart Buildings Initiative. Just a little bit of an update. The bow tie guys.
You guys short, we're still looking. Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for giving us a little bit of space on your agenda. We wanted to bring up Rosie as well, just to help us introduce this topic. We will give just a brief summary of where we're at and where we've come with the accounting mechanism that's part of the Smart Buildings Initiative that we've been working closely with Mick and others on. And then just open it up for questions from your end. We're hoping that we can introduce this discussion now and then have this as an action item to present some policy changes in May. So that's our thought. So we actually ended up writing a bill, as some of you are aware, that extended this conversation to all agencies. That bill was voted down on third reading last week in the House, but it started a very meaningful conversation, I think, with legislators, and the real crux of where we were going with that bill was how do we align incentives on the user scale so that the people spending money working for the state government are incentivized to save that money rather than incentivized to spend it. And people were very drawn to that conversation. We had a really good conversation. And so now's our opportunity to really make this model relevant at the university system scale. And the basic idea is twofold. One, we're very good in public institutions at talking about energy efficiency with new building projects. The conversation about operations and maintenance of old buildings isn't as developed, and so we're really trying to pursue means for helping incentivize agencies to go back into old buildings and update user systems so that they're saving us money. And the second part of it is how do we allow the universities, agencies, and so forth to essentially retain their savings and drive those savings back towards additional efficiency projects. And so that's really the crux of the accounting mechanism that we want to talk with you all about. The very general idea is that unspent utility dollars at the university systems or at the university level are able to be transferred back into an account that each university creates, and those accounts are then designated towards future energy projects. So the irony now that we're all familiar with is that if you don't spend it, you lose it in terms of public budgeting. And that's a problem that goes way beyond utility, and it's also extremely challenging. But that was kind of the starting point for our conversation with legislators, and it was a very good one. So I just would turn it over to Rosie to kind of give the brief explanation on the budget or accounting proposal that we have, and we do have diagrams for you all if you'd be interested, but I'll turn.
Madam Chair, members of the board, I think of performance funding, and I look at our students, and it's not hard to evaluate performance. And I have to tell you, that's how this all came about, because they just were not going to let it go. They were in my office day in and day out. Let's be creative, let's be creative, let's be creative. And so we did. We actually got out a whiteboard, and I got to thinking about it. And, you know, I'm one of those people that believe that there's always a way to get something accomplished if you just work hard enough. So anyway, the concept really is, and again, as you know, particularly on the state side, if you don't expend dollars, then you, in essence, when you go to do your base funding, you basically lose. And that's true in utilities. They use our base expenditures to determine what we're going to need for the next biennium. And so there's no incentive there, and there's no way to do good things and reduce your expenses so that you can reinvest them. And so they've actually turned out to be great accounting students. The whole concept is that we really, when we budget, that we actually use that budget 100% either to pay the utilities or to reinvest in these energy conservation projects. And what we would do, the way that we've designed it, is it would become a recharge center. Utilities would become a recharge center whereby the recharge would be equal to the budget. So dollars would move out from all sources, the utility bills would be paid, and then if there's savings, which we hope there will be, those would be transferred into a plant fund whereby projects, energy conservation projects, could be progress forward, and there would be some kind of a reporting on an annual basis of what those were and the progress that was being made. And it's just a way to capture some funding to accomplish what we all know is in our best interest. And so that's kind of a really high level. There's a lot of detail. We've gone through that with Mick and others, but that's the concept.
And Madam Chair, members of the committee, all I'd really add to this conversation is that as we were presenting this to legislators, those with whom we spoke were very supportive of kind of trying to crack that paradigm that was explained by these two. And I think what it comes down to is that some people are a little bit uncomfortable with how forward-thinking this really was in terms of breaking out of the biennium cycle and taking some of that appropriation authority away from the higher level politicians and putting it in the hands of the end users. What I see this process as being at the Regento level is us to demonstrate and put a foot forward to show that this type of thinking, this type of budgeting, this type of accounting can work and will work. And if we can prove that these incentives are going to happen at the university system level, which accounts for 60% of all buildings in the state, I would hope that next legislative cycle we might be able to show through our leadership at the university system level that this is a concept worth pursuing at a higher level. And I think that's what a lot of legislators that we talk to were looking for, is for someone to step forward, demonstrate that this is a concept that's not only feasible, but that works and incents people in the right way. And we can kind of work out the details in the accounting so that people become more comfortable with it on a higher level. We're certainly open to questions if you guys have any.
Thank you. Great conversation. Are there questions or comments from members of the board? Regent Teal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you guys. One thing I just wanted to say is Zach in particular has put a ton of work into this, and if you remember, this conversation started with the system office hiring Zach and Blake Bjornson for a summer for a pittance, and we got a lot of work out of them. Well, and students are cheap, so I realize this because I don't necessarily get paid a lot either. But your guys' work has been incredible, and I've been just blown away by how far you've taken this, and congratulations on that. And also, just an idea for the board. In the university system, we have a lot of classrooms, and not all of them have whiteboards at the front. And there are great opportunities for students in the system if we are willing to provide them. And they are opportunities that can obviously provide a great return on our investment. So just a consideration, I think that Zach and Blake kind of put forward a model that we might think about using to internalize student views in these conversations that are really, really complex some of the time. Let's hire them to do research, make it part of their education, and the product is going to be hopefully some information that we can really use. That being said, I did want to ask, earlier on in this conversation, there was also a discussion of monitoring systems and of goal setting for energy savings over time, with the hope that, over years we'd be able to set goals to slow the growth of utility costs. And I wonder, how does that enter into the accounting discussion?
Regent Teal, Madam Chair, thank you for the question. In terms of goal setting, I think that is a really valuable point, and I think we need to come back to that now. We've done enough of the other work that we've talked about where I think it would serve us well to come back to that part of the discussion now, so I appreciate that. In terms of metering, we've made a lot of progress. We found that many schools are already fully metered, which is really exciting. UM Western, for example, is really ahead of the curve, and that's something we discovered. We have a lot of work to do at the University of Montana, but we've invested a lot of dollars internally over the last year towards purchasing meters and installing them, and so it's certainly a work in progress. But I think all indications are that the whole university system and all campuses are moving in the right direction, and that certainly is the first step. You have to have the infrastructure in place to really see these savings and account for them and so forth, and it's the smart grid concept, and I think we're really moving in a direction towards all that. Just as an example, on the UM side, we're in the process of making a concise priority list for President Engstrom at his request so that we can see what investments we need to make in what order and what projects we need to target. And so that we're not 100% there by any means, but we've made a tremendous amount of progress, I think, with all of that. And as a follow-up, I would just say part of this conversation also was student and faculty involvement and how do we leverage those internal resources. I am very happy to report that MSU in particular has made a lot of really aggressive strides with that in terms of plugging in their engineering faculty and students, and there's a lot of interest there to use, for instance, engineering students and their senior capstone classes and projects towards facilities level energy efficiency projects. That really is part of this conversation we've been having, and so that part of it is coming along as well, which is really exciting to report. So,
thank you very much. I would like to just echo my appreciation first to Regent Teal for your efforts in facilitating the conversations between Zach and Blake and Bryn and the board and the commissioner's office. I want to thank you for that, and thank Commissioner Christian and Tyler Trevor and Mick Robinson for their support and their contributions to the conversation. And I want to recognize your persistence in moving this forward, and I would say that because of your persistence, we are a number of steps ahead for the next legislative session, and I think that you have an innovative plan on the table for how campuses could potentially move forward in the interim. And I think part of our conversation at the table last summer, Tyler, you, me, Blake, Mick, spoke to, how those opportunities may not be of the size and scope that ultimately we want to get to, but I think that they are a starting point for us and an opportunity to demonstrate success of the initiative to the next legislative session. So I want to thank you and recognize you for your persistence and your very forward-thinking efforts in this regard. They have not gone unnoticed, and your voice on this matter is, I think, the appropriate and the right voice at the right time. So thank you very much. Are there further questions or comments from members of the board?
Madam Chair.
Regent Williams.
I wonder if Mick would, our budget director, would be willing to speak some to this. I'm wondering in particular, Mick, with regard to the revenue flow, there are both complexities and contention about where the savings end up. Do they go to the general fund? Do they go to the fund that the students are suggesting? And that will be a matter to be considered and perhaps worked out in the future. Do you have any early comments about either concern or acceptance of the change of the flow of the savings?
Well, Regent Williams, I have worked with Rosie Keller in terms of the development of the concept of of how we might apply this accounting-wise within the campus. And we do have to have further discussions, campus-specific discussions, because this really is probably, as we move forward with this, more of a specific campus determination of how the accounting mechanism will work. But I think conceptually, if the campus and the board is interested in moving forward in this manner, it can be done. It certainly, there are some differences in terms of, as you talk about utility forecasting for a particular year, certainly the usage versus the price of that commodity has some impact. And so there are going to be some assumptions and judgments that will have to be blended into that mechanism. But I think that we do have an accounting mechanism that will be able to apply to our various fund types and transfer savings into a plant fund account that would allow further investments in energy saving opportunities.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, Rosie, as you've considered this flow chart mechanism, which is somewhat unique, do you think it's workable as it currently is, or are there some compromises that may be of value here?
Regent Williams, I think it's like Mick said, I think that we're going to have to get into the details, but absolutely, I think it's possible. I mean, I think it's a mechanism that could work. We are going to have to work with each campus because each campus does do things a little differently, and I think we have to recognize the uniqueness of each of them. But I think it really is a way to move the idea that the students have brought forward to reality. I think it's something that we definitely can do, very much so.
Thank you. Finally, I want to join with the others in the recognition of the innovative idea here and the hard work that both of you have put in to see it to reality. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Regent Williams. Further questions or comments from members of the board? Mr. Brown.
Madam Chair, thank you. I just wanted to follow up and say that we would certainly be remiss not to, first of all, recognize Blake, who would have liked to be here, who he's watching on his computer somewhere, and also thank all of you for your support through this whole process. Commissioner Christian, Mick, Frida, Rosie. Certainly, we think that this is an innovative concept that gets to a real core culture in the way the public sector appropriates money, and so we're really excited to continue to have this conversation, and you all have given us a really great platform to have that conversation, and so we're very appreciative of that, and appreciative to Commissioner Christian and Mick to tolerating the headaches that we've given them throughout the last couple of months. So, and I would just leave you with two kind of bullet points. I think that one is that, yes, I really have become convinced that this is a really innovative concept after all the conversations we've had and all the nerves we've struck and so forth. And the second part is just to really leave you with this is an opportunity to put more resources on the table for investing in energy efficiency. I think the status quo of the way we invest in energy projects leaves us at this kind of point of stasis where costs aren't really driving downward. And I think this is an opportunity for us to really invest in a meaningful way towards those savings so we can drive down costs in a meaningful way over time. So that's where we're hoping to go with this, and we look forward to continuing the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. We do too. Thank you very much. For the last and final item on the information agenda, I look to Kia Abbey from MSU.
Is that better? There we go. Madam Chair, members of the board, we're here to talk to you today specifically about the way that student-generated fees are reviewed. The first time I came in front of this board was actually last spring when I was first elected in office with no experience in student government and a little bit nervous to be there, but very excited to be back and having this conversation again. Last year, if you guys recall, in the May meeting, we had two fees in front of you, or three, I guess, if you count the student newspaper fee at MSU. that were put forward by students through a majority vote of the student body in our spring elections. One of particular note to me was our student group activity fee at the University of Montana. The fee was brought forward in an off year in what we considered an extenuating circumstance because students had voted for the fee and students felt and expressed very strongly to us that they deserved to see the fruit of their labor. And I'd just like to first give a little status check on that. We were able to budget last weekend at ASUM about 3 times the amount to student groups this year that we ever have before, and we're very excited about that and certainly very appreciative of your guys' willingness to allow us to do that. Unfortunately, though, I love to take credit for doing that because it puts us in a very positive light among the student body and among student groups at our campus. But it really was the group before us that initiated the idea, that put the concept forward and did all the legwork to really get this vote passed. Unfortunately, and this is kind of where the conundrum begins, is that student governments budget differently than the university. We don't budget based on enrollment projections. We budget based on the actual fee revenue received from the year before. So we actually budget for 13-14 from money brought in from fees in 12-13. This means that as fees are brought forward by students, if they're reviewed biennially, if they come forward in an off year and have to wait one more year, there's the potential that students who went out of their way to campaign for and to put their voice behind a fee could have to wait up to 3 years in order for that to really be put into action from student governments. And with as much focus as this board has put on getting people through the pipe and through college in 4 years, 3 years starts to feel like a really long time for students. As leaders at the student level, it's important to us to be responsive to our constituents and to be responsive to the goals that we bring forward. And so what we would propose then is an amendment to policy 940.12.1 that would allow student-generated fees, those that are voted on by student bodies, by student governments, to be allowed to be reviewed in off years as well. And this is, of course, with the understanding, and I know that I probably would receive a question from Regent Buchanan on this, the understanding that students more than anyone realize the cost of higher education and are very conscious of what it is that we're willing to tax ourselves and to put forward and put on the table to address needs that we see as needing to be filled. So with that, I'll pass it off to Kia.
All right. Thanks, Bryn. So before we get much further, I just want to read the proposed amendment. This would be to policy 940.12.1, and it would read, student-generated fees will be considered annually at the May Board of Regents meeting. A student-generated fee shall be defined as any fee that the associated students of any Montana University System campus has authority to enact and disperse as vested in them by the Montana Board of Regents. And so I want to make the point that student fees were originally intended to allow students to levy taxes on themselves, which I think is really, it's exciting when students can identify a need and address that need. And it's exciting for student governments to be able to address it immediately and in the near future and not having to wait for 3 years. And so this amendment would allow students to be proactive in addressing student needs. Currently, we have broad support across the state from student governments. You'll be getting formal resolutions in support of that in the next couple weeks. And basically, we just look forward to making sure that this is a really thoughtful and effective amendment when it comes up as an action item in May. So with that, Bryn and I look forward to taking any questions or comments.
Thank you both for the presentation. Are there questions or comments from members of the board? And this will come to the board in May. So are there questions or comments from members of the board? Regent Buchanan.
First, thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, thank you for the thoughtful laying out of this. And I thought maybe I'd just kind of give a little context as to why we had the discussion that started in May. And by no means any of my opinions or votes are not meant to reflect my opinion as to the use of those fees. But I think about the cost of education a lot, and it predicates most of the decisions that I end up making. And I kind of consider the cycle that's in place represents folks that have a little bit more conservative approach towards budgeting, a structural barrier towards increasing the cost of education. if we were to make these changes, which I'm not sure how I'm going to vote, but if we were to make these changes, it could be considered somewhat of a gateway into other expansions to continue to see fees get in front of us. And so I think the premise of my concern, as Bren put, is absolutely right. I mean, I am very fearful of the rapid pace of growing costs associated to attending school. And I guess I would encourage us to think about it in a couple of different ways, and then I'd ask a question. When you came to us with those fees last time, one of the conversation pieces was the amount of students that had participated in the vote. I mean, I wouldn't be against using rules like we use at the legislative process, where reconsideration is an option when a higher participation rate is to reach the floor. I mean, I think you understand what I'm saying. I think it's very thoughtful the way you're putting it. And then a question, you'd mentioned that you just funded a record amount of groups with the recent budget. I mean, I think without, my impression of the way student government's budget is you still have a lot of reallocation authority. Certain things that you're funding aren't enshrined. You have the ability to move resources to fund new initiatives. So I guess some clarity on that. I mean, sometimes making a hard decision, moving money from one initiative to another, is the role of student leadership. And so when there's no new fee or no new resources on the table, something I think we as a board push ourselves to try to consider. And certainly successful companies and successful organizations do that a lot, because the resource pool does not automatically grow. And for someone like me who's fearful of allowing expenses to go up with any new mechanism, maybe shed some light for me. I mean, how do you guys perceive your ability to move funds? And I think it's exciting that you funded a record number of students. Obviously, you either decreased money going to one of the groups to find money to fund a new group or something to those effects. Help me see a little bit of how that process occurred and your perception of ability to do those types of reallocations.
Yeah, absolutely. Madam Chair, Regent Buchanan, I'd first say that one of the biggest differences that we face between our budgeting cycles and those of the university is that we, as autonomous bodies, budget every year based on the priorities of the administration that comes forward. And with the new administration each year at the student level, it's a little bit different conversation, because we're not talking about a present law adjustment. We're talking about a full new look from a zero-based fund, reflecting the priorities of one year's leadership, which creates an interesting dynamic, certainly. And to address the question, I guess, about making the hard decisions and reallocating funds in that way, we still face hard decisions this year, certainly, because much of the money that student governments have is tied up in classified staff members, which through the growth of our respective organizations over time has become more or less obligated to those folks, and certainly reflect the initiatives and the missions of our organizations. For example, I know the highest paid salary member at ASMSU is their lawyer, who provides subsidized legal services to students on campus who wouldn't otherwise be allowed to go, or wouldn't afford to go off campus to receive those services. So they really do play a valuable role. We felt particularly lucky this year to have that increase in fee, because as the University of Montana faced an enrollment decline, our budget too felt that decline. We had to make some hard decisions to cut out the budget to reflect that, because this entire new fee that we put forward wasn't just to expand our budget. It wasn't just so that we had more money to play with. It was so that this money could specifically go towards a problem that we felt wasn't being addressed, and that was, we fund student groups through our student governance organization. We weren't able to do that to the extent that we felt would really benefit students on our campus. So even as we saw our general budget decline through the decrease in enrollment, we saw our overall budget expand, which allowed us to really empower these student groups in a year in which they otherwise wouldn't have, in a way that we felt was really meaningful and positive.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Regent Buchanan. ASMSU is run a little bit differently. So we have our activity fee, which is about $79 a semester, and within that, there's 5 different fees. We've got our intramural fee, our registered student organization fee, our sustainability fee, our bus fee, and our press fee. And those fees have to be allocated to address those issues. And then, of course, we've got the rest of the budget goes to our different programs and the different initiatives we want to push forward. But a large amount of our funding, it has to go towards what it's intended for. So there is a little bit of wiggle room to move fees around, fee monies around to address initiatives. But as I said, a lot of it has to go towards what that fee was intended for. So our student activities, for instance, our student groups are funded through our RSO fee, which will be coming to you in May with an increase. And with an increase in student involvement, we need to increase that fee. Right now, we are funding student organizations, I think, at about half what's requested, and it's really the only funding source that we can provide for student organizations on our campus, which provide a wide range of different services to our students. We're also, I think you'll be happy to hear, that we're going to be offering a fundraiser training to educate student groups on how they can go and make private-public partnerships, if you will. And so we're really excited about that so they can start subsidizing these groups. But yeah, as I said, a lot of our fee monies are wrapped up in different intended uses. So.
Thank you, Regent Teal.
Speaking of student group fundraising, I think EWB raised $150,000 in the past year, so there are groups that do a pretty good job at that. But I think one thing that concerns me in this conversation, I understand the critique of the number of students who participate in these votes, and also the critique of oftentimes the students who participate are maybe not representative of the students who would be most heavily impacted financially by an increase in fees. That's something that I think we do need to consider and find ways to troubleshoot. That being said, I think what Kia said is really an important consideration. Originally, student fees, as far as I understand in the history of universities, were a levy upon students by students to provide services that the university wouldn't or couldn't. That's no longer the case. As Kia said, the ASMSU, the student-generated fee at MSU, is about $79. The overall fees that students pay, much greater than that. I'd say for most students, it's 4 or 5 times that much. What that means is that a majority of the fees that we consider every year, and I don't know that we really consider in great depth, are not student-generated. They're things that are providing services on the campus that perhaps we should be including in tuition. And in fact, it's board policy to encourage campuses to, over time, include more of those fees in tuition. My worry is we are providing so much scrutiny of student-generated fees, students levying fees on themselves, without providing much scrutiny as to why all of these services that campuses should be providing students aren't included in tuition. And the effect is all of those fees are much easier to increase over time than is tuition. So I think that if you would look over the past 6 or 8 years, fees have increased at a much higher rate than tuition. And that's why, you know, if you look at estimated cost just in tuition and fees at our campuses, it's still going up, even though we as Regents say, wait, we've capped tuition 4 out of the last 6 years. So I think that there's another conversation that needs to be had here, and I'm, as a student, pretty supportive of students being able to vote to provide services that they think are important that campuses simply can't provide.
Thank you, Regent Teal. Commissioner Christian.
Madam Chair, I think it's a very good point. I also think to Regent Buchanan's comments, I just want to go back just to the basis of the policy, and I'm supportive of the student fees. Regent Teal, I understand exactly where they come from, and I think you're right. But I think one of the things that has caused an inordinate amount of scrutiny on them has been the timing. And so I just want to, I think it's important board members realize that the reason the policy was set up goes back to Regent Teal's other point, which is it is important to some extent. And that's not to say that we can't carve these out if that's the wish of the board, but it is important to some extent the way it is set up that we view and value these increases in totality. And whenever you take them one at a time, a 50-cent increase or a $1 increase, it's not that big a deal. The reason that we've always said, okay, all fees and tuition will be set every other year in May is so you can get to the end of the cycle and say, okay, but overall we're going to have a $413 increase to students, and that's significant. And so, you know, I think there is some importance to the way the policy was written in that it gives board members the ability to view all of these decisions together instead of in a vacuum, because you make different decisions in a vacuum. And I think you could see some creep, even more than we already have seen in fees if you start looking at them one at a time, because it candidly is fairly easy to justify them one at a time, and the increases, we haven't really seen increases in fees that are more than 3%. That's been kind of the guideline, and that's pretty marginal, but 3% over 6 years starts to turn into real money. And so I think that's the basis of why the policy was written the way it was. And if we want to consider changing that, it clearly doesn't really fit in with the students' agenda and how that cycle is, and it's why it's here before you, and I get that. But to Regent Buchanan's other point, I would I probably have a softer spot to this conversation with the students than I really don't want to see us start looking at other fees on an annual basis or a whenever we think we need to basis, because I just think then we're going to have departmental level fees coming at us all the time as things change and costs change, and it's going to get much harder to control in totality, and I think we'll see more creep and more increases that way than we are currently even.
Thank you, Commissioner Christian. Bryn.
Sure, Madam Chair, Commissioner Christian. Certainly, we're very, very appreciative of the effort that you guys put in maintaining a low cost of education. As someone who's felt the creep of fees over the last 4 years, I completely agree that it's very worth looking at them in totality. I think the difference in this conversation in student-generated versus non-student-generated is that often fees have this kind of looming cloud over the name where they're always viewed as a negative thing. But as Kia explained, this is a chance for students, if we're willing to put forward through a majority vote, to address something that we see as being absolutely needed on our campus. So I'd say that as the beneficiaries of us trying to address these needs, it is, from my perspective, very important that we're timely about responding to those needs, because it's those students who felt the need was to be addressed that put that fee forward initially. And if we have that lag, that's kind of where the tension comes from the student perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. I would ask, and maybe I'm oversimplifying this conversation about considering them in totality versus rather considering them in a vacuum, and perhaps an amendment to what you would submit to us might require you to provide to the board with any fee increase submittals, that have come to the board perhaps 2 years, 3 years prior, so that the board could consider them in totality and have a good conversation around that. So we're not having a conversation in a vacuum.
Madam Chair, that's certainly friendly.
Are there further questions or comments? Regent Williams.
Madam Chair, let me just segment out of this whole discussion one piece of it, and that is the matter of student participation in voting in their own elections. Students vote higher in their own elections than the rest of us do in ours in Montana. Students also vote higher in the general primaries in general, the public elections, than the rest of us do. But we've gotten to something here that's a little different than that point. Because American turnout, not speaking about just student turnout now, because American turnout is so low, what would we think if the Congress entered the fray? And by the way, we are their Congress. What would we think if the Congress entered the fray and said, we're going to second guess what those people think who didn't vote? We're going to develop policy on the non-voters. It'd be a violation. It'd be a kink in our representative democracy. I suggest we cannot speak for those students who didn't vote. We cannot assume why they didn't vote, nor can we say the decision by the majority of students who did vote doesn't count because not enough of them turned out. I don't think we can go there. We wouldn't like another body doing it to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Williams. Further questions or comments from members of the board? Regent Teal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one last quick comment. I think that the crux of the argument for me is that it does come down to these are not I think, typical fees. We're saying this is specific to student-generated fees. They would come to the board at a specific time during the year, so we would be able to understand the totality of fees being proposed across the system that are student-generated. This is not, in my mind, I think, opening up the floodgates to fees being on every single board agenda. So I understand the argument and the discussion around wanting to view fees and the total cost of education at a single time so that we understand the larger picture. But I also think that some respect is deserved to student governments, to allow them to have some self-determination, to the student body to have some self-determination. I think that just because of the, hopefully students graduate, student turnover, the policy as currently written can be an inhibitor to that maybe isn't completely fair. I think that there are some common sense ways that we can place limits so that we don't see significant creep over time in this admittedly small component of the overall cost of education. But I do think that it might, it makes sense for us to find ways to fit with the student budget on the one area that they have to really control their own education.
Thank you, Regent Teal. Regent Krause.
Have we ever said no? I mean, I don't know. I don't think I've said no, but, has the board refused to grant a student fee? In the second guessing, the way Regent Williams talked about?
Madam Chair, Regent Krause, we have. I don't know if we've said no to an increase. We've said no in several instances to fees being levied at all, like the Montpurg deal in Missoula for a time was not allowed to be collected, or we've changed how it's collected. We've grappled with that some, but we don't often say no to that. Another example, I guess, is Montana Tech. There's a student fee on the recreation facility that we ultimately ended up approving at a lower number, but we disapproved for several meetings because we thought it was too high. I mean, the increase was 100% or something, and we worked some solutions to make the project still happen and got it done with the lower student fees. So there's been some instances, that we've went against the will of the students, and certainly this policy moves forward or not, that is the prerogative of the board. The wish of the students, they vote, but that vote is merely representing to the board the will of the students. It's the board's decision to either approve those fees or not.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's an important distinction, is that we still have the ability to say no. I think that's the main thing. And there are a lot of reasons, and I'm not sure, since we've been disagreeing all morning, but I'm not sure I think we're a different model than the Congress, the representative democracy that Regent Williams talked about. But I do think we have a responsibility to control costs, and you could see where we would spend a lot of time controlling costs here, and then that sort of gap would be filled up at the discretion of the students, and would we be serving the students as a whole and the people of the state the way that we have been charged to do. And so I think there are some reasons for us to maintain that discretion. I don't have any problem with the timing of it, but I just wanted to get on the record with the rest of it.
Thank you, Regent Krause. And I think you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, we can ultimately say no to any fee increase. But I think the crux of the question is, can we have the debate and have the debate about the increase versus the debate about the policy like we had last May? And so I think that's what the students are asking, is that we give them the opportunity to bring their fees to the table. So I think it's been a very productive and a very enjoyable conversation, and we thank you for leading the way. Did you have something to say in closing?
Yeah, I have one more thing. Thank you for hearing this today. And as I said earlier, we are so willing to work with anybody who has any amendments to this. One of the things that I want to be very diligent about is how we define student-generated fees. So in the future, this is not a policy that's taken advantage of. So I want to ensure that these are coming from the student bodies, from the student governments, and however we can make that language more clear in the policy, I would love to do that. And then lastly, I want to extend a thank you to Deputy Commissioner Robinson. He's been great in helping us work on this policy, answering questions nearly weekly. So thank you for hearing this, and we look forward to having lunch with you all.
Thank you. We appreciate you bringing it to our attention. Thank you very much. If you would just indulge me for a moment, I am looking around the room and then maybe even back there behind the divider, and I think we have a number of our students across the MUS here, and I would just ask you all to stand, please, so that we could recognize you and thank you for the good work that you're doing on behalf of your campuses. Thank you all so much. I'm hopeful we'll have a few minutes at the end of the day to get up to the rotunda and see how things look, but I'm confident that they're shaking out nicely. We thank you for your leadership on that.
Thank you all so much.
At this time now in our agenda, we will open it up for public comment on items on the Budget Committee that are relevant to the Budget Committee, but before I do, I would turn it over to the Commissioner. So is there any public comment? Any public comment? Any public comment? Okay, seeing none then, we will recess until 1:15.
Madam Chair, we are in the, I think we get lunch here, and then we go over into where we were this morning for a break. The other thing I would like to note is that I have noticed, and I will pledge to work with the presidents to make sure that we do a little safety training at our chancellor and deputy commissioner level, since they're all hobbling around.
Hello, Madam Secretary. I heard you were in the building, but we were looking around and then we didn't see you, so welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm here to speak on behalf of Pat Williams' appointment to the Board of Regents. For the record, I'm Linda McCullough. I appreciate this meeting's public comment period to address this issue at this time. I spent 20 years as an elementary school librarian and teacher. I was elected to the legislature for 6 years and was elected as superintendent of public instruction, where I was the first superintendent to take their seat on the Board of Regents. I did so because I have a genuine love of higher education. It's awfully good to be back at a Regents meeting. After 8 years as a superintendent, I was elected the first woman Secretary of State of Montana, and I'm just beginning my second term. More to the point, I have 8 seats at the University of Montana football games for over 20 years. I have rarely missed a game in all those years, and that's in all those campaigns. I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to say, go Grizz. Pat Williams began his career as a teacher and completed it by being a teacher at the University of Montana. This is Pat Williams. He was elected and reelected to the Montana House of Representatives from Butte, America. He is recognized as serving more consecutive terms in the U.S. House of Representatives than anyone in the history of the state of Montana. While there, he was a member of the Education and Labor Committee and chaired the Committee on Post-Secondary Education. This is Pat Williams. While serving in Congress, his accomplishments included the College Middle Income Assistance Act, the Toddlers and Childhood Disability Act, and passed the first legislation signed into law by President Clinton, the Family and Medical Leave Act. This is Pat Williams. As chairman of the Post-Secondary Education Committee, he protected the National Endowment for the Arts from elimination. Pat also championed the high school in the Northern Cheyenne Reservation and the Two River Eagle School on the Flathead Reservation in Pablo. This is Pat Williams. He was responsible for the legislative creation of the Rural Disabilities National Research Lab and the Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, both at the University of Montana. He also passed legislation for the Agriculture Plant Research Center at the University the Montana State University. This is Pat Williams. He led the development of the Western think tank, the Progressive Policy Institute Western Progress, with offices throughout the West. In addition, he was a senior fellow and regional policy associate for the Center at the Rocky Mountain West. He served as a director for the National Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges and was on the President's Advisory Commission for Tribal Colleges. And he served on the board of directors of the Student Loan Marketing Association. This is Pat Williams. And now he is appointed by Governor Brian Schweitzer as a member of the Board of Regents of the Montana University System. He has a resume that literally lives and breathes education. He's earned this appointment. There's no one more qualified. And I didn't even tell you that he was a student at the University of Montana and the father of 3 U of M graduates. To mischaracterize his comments about a small handful of current and former players charged with crimes from assault to rape to burglary is a travesty. Some people are reading Pat's words completely out of context. He not only asked about, nor was he referring to the entire football team. So, let's get on with the business of education. Let's put someone on the Board of Regents who not only has an expertise with education, but a true love of higher education. Let's keep Pat Williams working on the Board of Regents. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Okay. Is there further public comment? Then I think what we will do is we will break for lunch and we will come back at 1:15.